everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Reincarnated as a slime, demon or savior. Chapter 86 to 95. Ambush smoke and dust filled the sky over this fallen, bustling city in the central western part of the empire. The once orderly and magnificent complex of city-state buildings was already in ruins. Shattered bricks and collapsed building debris could be seen everywhere on the streets. Broken military flags stood crookedly in the ruins. The lingering heat of war baked the air, and the entire land permeated with the dead silence of having just experienced a brutal battle. This place should have been the core of the war zone, where the Red Corps had leveled the front lines and completely occupied it, and tens of thousands of fully armed Legion soldiers should have been filling every thoroughfare in the city. But at this moment in the vast empty city, not even a single figure or a trace of magical fluctuation remained, leaving only the unscattered smoke drifting silently. High above in the clear yet biting sky, space ripples suddenly surged violently, and a slender figure with supreme pressure stood out of thin air. Valgrind looked down at the devastated city below, her sharp gaze sweeping across the entire urban area, carefully probing the magical traces of every inch of space, but as far as her eyes could see, it was empty. The Red Corps that should have been entrenched here had completely disappeared, leaving no trace of stationing, fighting, or evacuation. She frowned slightly, her cold voice carrying a hint of imperceptible gravity, ringing softly in the high altitude. Large-scale spatial transfer magic, moving all troops entirely. MIA step too late. Before the words fell, a gentle voice with a calm smile sounded slowly from the shadows of the ruins below without warning, piercing through the smoke and dust, and clearly reaching Valgrind's ears. You finally arrived, Valgrind. I have been waiting for you here for a long time. Valgrind was startled, subconsciously looking down in the direction of the sound. On the highest ruin platform in the center of the city, Rimur stood quietly at the top of the rubble. She had a slender but steady figure, her blue-silver long hair swaying gently in the breeze, her golden eyes calmly watching the silver-haired goddess in the sky, and there was no ostentatious leakage of magic power around her, yet she exuded an unfathomable foundation. This scene left Valgrind stunned, her clear eyes filled with extreme disbelief, and her tone suddenly heightened, full of shock. How is this possible? You are clearly still within the borders of the Jura Tempest Federation. She quickly ran through the ability knowledge in her mind, a light flashed in her eyes, and she instantly understood the truth, her tone filled with surprise and a hint of unwillingness. Parallel existence. You actually have this ability too. Valgrind slowly restrained the shock in her heart, her fingertips moved slightly, the magic power around her slowly rose, her cold face stained with a bit of gravity, and she openly admitted, fine, we were indeed careless this time. Facing Valgrind's exclamation and vigilance, Rimur looked indifferent, without extra words and without any small talk or probing. Since the confrontation had already begun, there was no need to waste words. A harsh thunderclap tore through the silent sky, and a pitch-black lightning bolt in Rimur's hand struck straight at Valgrind in the sky, with a speed so fast that the air vibrated violently. Facing this unexpected and sharp offensive, Valgrind was already prepared, and her reaction was extremely swift. She looked stern, her jade hand lifted lightly, and her palm instantly supported a layer of brilliant and dazzling barrier. The pitch-black lightning slammed into the barrier, and the two extreme forces instantly collided and exploded violently. The violent magic shockwave centered on the point where the two fought, crazily sweeping through the entire ruined city, and the surrounding rubble, broken walls, and debris were all blown away by the airflow and ground into powder, and the smoke and dust soared into the sky again. The dazzling magic light covered the whole world, and a confrontation between strong opponents had officially begun. The shockwave of the collision of the two magical powers had not yet dissipated, and the floating rubble and smoke were still falling slowly. In midair, Rimura moved, and a pair of pitch-black, translucent demon wings suddenly unfolded behind her. Rimura flew up lightly, stepping on the broken airflow and soaring straight up, quickly climbing to a height of 1,000 meters, her posture calm, the oppressive magic power around her continuing to accumulate, without any sign of passive defense. Seeing this, Valgrind's eyes in the sky turned cold. She was surrounded by hot, blazing red fire, and the pure aura baked the entire sky, causing the cold air at high altitude to instantly boil and twist. She turned into a red stream of light, carrying the hot heat wave, and chasing after her without hesitation. But the moment Velgrind caught up, her pupils suddenly shrank, and the highest alert was raised in her heart. Rimuru was constructing a very dangerous spell in her hand. Nuclear strike magic. Velgrind shouted, her voice carrying extreme gravity. She knew the horror of nuclear strike magic all too well. Once it was fully formed and released, everything around it would instantly turn into nothingness, and even she did not want to take this destructive blow head-on. In a flash of thought, Velgrind no longer held back, and used the ultimate skill Charity King to release the heat haze cannon. The endless flame power was extremely compressed, condensed, and converged in her palm, and all the violent flame magic elements were completely squeezed and condensed, finally turning into a slender but dazzling deep red thermal fusion beam. The beam was surrounded by fire patterns that burned the sky, and wherever it passed, the space melted layer by layer, causing scorching red ripples. The floating rubble nearby was directly vaporized by the high temperature before it could get close, leaving nothing behind. Without hesitation, Velgrind pushed her fingertips, and the thermal fusion beam tore through the sky, shooting directly at Rimuru with extreme speed, the terrifying high temperature even suppressing the harsh sound of breaking through the air. Rimuru's universal perception was pushed to the limit at this moment, and before the beam arrived, the terrifying high-temperature thermal energy capable of destroying an asteroid had already completely locked onto her. Just a moment of perception intersection, and Rimuru clearly understood in her heart the power of this single blow was enough to destroy an entire asteroid. Rimuru decisively used Beelzebub to swallow this attack. The violent flame energy surged and exploded crazily, and the hot energy torrent tried to burn and explode the black hole barrier, but no matter how violent and terrifying this energy was, as long as it encountered Beelzebub, it would be instantly dismantled, absorbed, and swallowed. In just an instant, the finishing move Heat Haze Cannon released by Velgrind through Charity King was cleanly and thoroughly swallowed up, and not even a trace of residual heat leaked out. Velgrind in midair had her pupils shaking, and for the first time, an unconcealable look of astonishment appeared on her beautiful face. She knew the value of her blow best, but the Rimuru in front of her had so casually swallowed the heaven-burning level flame offensive. After a brief shock, the monstrous fighting spirit and dragon prestige soared again. Velgrind gripped her 5 fingers in the air, and magic elements gathered crazily, quickly molding into a simple and slender weapon in her palm, a green dragon crescent blade. The moment the divine weapon took shape, Velgrind turned into a prairie red shadow, carrying the heat wave of burning the sky and the momentum of peerless slashing, holding the green dragon crescent blade and rushing straight towards Rimuru, the blade momentum locking the 4 directions of space, sealing all room for evasion. Facing the swift and fierce flame slash, Rimuru's expression did not change, using Storm King to release the breath of the death wind. The dead, biting, and life-depriving wind instantly swept across the entire airspace, the invisible wind power condensed to the extreme, turning into overwhelming pitch-black wind blades, thousands of dead winds intertwined layer by layer, building an unsolvable desperate wind domain, facing Velgrind head-on. But the next scene was completely unexpected. Velgrind's green dragon crescent blade flashed suddenly. A crisp and sharp slashing sound resounded through the sky, and the blade edge carrying the divine power of scorching dragon flames swept out. The wind of death originating from the Storm King authority, capable of tearing everything apart and splitting space, was vulnerable in front of this divine weapon. Countless pitch-black wind blades were easily cut open and severed by the sharpness of the green dragon crescent blade, and the remaining silence wind was instantly burned to nothing by the super-high heat dragon flames overflowing from the blade. The sky full of deadly wind domains was actually forcibly split and dissipated by a single green dragon crescent blade. Rimuru raised her eyebrows slightly, sighing softly with feigned surprise, her tone carrying just the right amount of realization. So it's an artifact-class weapon, no wonder. Hearing this, Velgrind curled her lips in a sneer of disdain. The flames around her intensified. Looking down from above, with eyes full of absolute confidence and arrogance, her cold voice rang out with playful mockery. "Humph, to think you'd attempt to defeat me using Veldora's skills, what a pipe dream. You should know, Veldora has never once defeated me." Before the words had even faded, Velgrind pressed her advantage. Wielding her green dragon blade wreathed in the scorched dragon's flames, she slashed down fiercely at Rimuru. The scorching blade pressure locked onto Rimuru's every possible movement, sealing off all avenues of retreat. Facing this inevitable, lethal strike, Rimuru remained calm. He drew the blade at his waist with a backhand grip, the blade condensed with pitch-black magic, and blocked it steadily in front of him. The explosive sound of metal clashing rang through the heavens. Pitch-black magic and scorching dragon flames collided violently, and a berserk shockwave swept across the high sky once more. Rimuru received the heavy slash steadily, his figure merely swayed slightly, not retreating a single inch. With the strike failing, Valgrind immediately used the recoil to retreat, distancing herself by dozens of meters in a flash. In the next instant, red light exploded around her, she would no longer hold back any trump cards. The phantom of the scorched dragon slowly emerged behind her. Boiling magicules surged to the heavens. Her humanoid body transformed rapidly, enveloped in flame scales covered her skin, dragon horns protruded, and she fully assumed the majestic scorched dragon form. Not only that, she also used parallel existence, creating several identical copies of herself. They surrounded the airspace from all directions, trapping Rimuru in the very center of the encirclement, leaving no gap for a breakout. The scorched dragon clones from all directions raised their hands simultaneously, fully unleashing the ultimate skill compassionate king, with layers of firepower superimposed and amplified. Each clone condensed a crimson thermal beam, thicker and more violent than before. With multiple powers superimposed, the power of the thermal beam cannon surged several times over. The terrifying high temperature, capable of burning the sky and destroying the earth, caused the space to collapse continuously. Countless flame cannons, locked onto his lethal points, were aimed at Rimuru in the center, radiating killing intent. Valgrind thought coldly with certainty. Beelzebub can only devour attacks from a single direction after all. With my multidirectional superposed lethal attacks, he will be overwhelmed and unable to devour them all, and in the end, he will surely be blasted to smithereens by the remaining flame bombardment. However, facing the star-destroying flame assault coming from all directions, Rimuru's expression remained calm, entirely devoid of the panic Valgrind had anticipated. He simply raised his hand and spread it slightly, instantly activating the ultimate skill Covenant King. A transparent yet absolutely stable barrier instantly unfolded. Layer upon layer, countless barrier walls wove together, enveloping every direction around him. Multi-layer barrier. The next second, the dense, multi-reinforced thermal beam cannon, carrying the power of destruction, struck all at once, slamming fiercely against the multi-layer barrier. Earth-shattering explosions rang out incessantly. Crimson flames swallowed the entire airspace, and the berserk torrent of high heat washed over the barrier walls repeatedly, yet it could not penetrate those solid layers of barriers in the slightest. Rimuru's indifferent voice rang out slowly, his cold tone carrying absolute confidence, echoing through the smoke-filled sky. If this is all you have, then you won't be able to defeat me. As the words faded, the battle situation changed abruptly. Without giving Valgrind and her clones in the surrounding airspace any chance to react, charge up, or evade, the space in the entire high sky suddenly solidified. An invisible, sacred aura instantly enveloped the surroundings. Countless fine, brilliant golden particles emerged from the void, gathering and circulating. Thousands of particles rapidly wove, joined, and shaped themselves. In an instant, a giant magic circle, covering the entire battle airspace with intricate and sacred patterns, took form. The entire process had no chanting, no charging, and no signs of magical fluctuation. Because it had been laid as an ambush in advance. The extremely holy golden light flowed through every inch of the magic circle's patterns. A sacred aura, transcending the mundane and superior to all elemental magic, burst forth. It completely enveloped all the scorched dragon form Valgrind clones, locking her firmly within the core of the magic circle, sealing off any possibility of spatial shifting or magical escape. Inside the magic circle, the high-temperature flames were forcibly suppressed, the scorched dragon's aura dissipated layer by layer, and the flame magic around Valgrind was completely imprisoned and sealed by the sacred law. Rimuru, at the center of the barrier, had cold eyes. He raised his hand, locking onto the trapped Valgrind from afar, and shouted in a deep voice, activating a forbidden ultimate technique. Let me see how tenacious your vitality is. Sanctuary-type disintegration. The moment the words fell, the entire golden magic circle suddenly blazed to the extreme. Blinding golden light swallowed heaven and earth, all colors in the world were covered by the pure white, sacred radiance. The void in the high sky trembled violently, wrinkling and twisting. An unimaginably massive amount of spirit particle energy crazily collapsed, detonated, and gathered. In the next instant, a giant golden pillar of light, connecting heaven and earth, plummeted from the top of the firmament, striking straight at Velgrind in the center of the magic circle. The heaven-destroying and earth-shattering explosion shook the firmament for 100 miles. The ultimate sacred power erupted completely within the absolute domain imprisoned by the magic circle. All impact and destructive force were completely locked within the magic circle, acting entirely upon Velgrind alone, with not a fraction leaking out. The piercing sounds of burning, the shattering of dragon scales, and the collapse of magic power intertwined, resounding through the airspace. As a scorched dragon, her formidable dragon body would normally be enough to withstand a star-destroying offensive, but under the ultimate offensive of sanctuary-type disintegration, she could no longer maintain her complete form. The indestructible red dragon scales exploded, carbonized, and turned to dust piece by piece. The dragon body, flowing with hot dragon blood, was continuously dissolved and incinerated layer by layer. The dragon flames surrounding her were completely extinguished by the sacred power, and her powerful dragon body's functions continued to collapse and decay. Velgrind's several parallel existence clones were the first to be completely annihilated, leaving only her main body struggling to support itself amidst the endless bombardment of golden light. After several seconds of extreme devastation that felt both long and short, the golden pillar of light connecting heaven and earth slowly receded and vanished without a trace, and the sacred radiance filling the sky, and the giant magic circle faded away as well. In the high sky, the raging energy completely subsided, and the smoke drifted away slowly. The majestic, flame-engulfed scorched dragon form was nowhere to be seen. Only a broken, riddled with holes dragon-shaped corpse remained floating in midair. Large swaths of dragon scales had peeled off and charred. The dragon body was pierced in many places by the power of disintegration. It was bloody and covered in wounds. The originally extremely powerful dragon breath was now weak to the extreme, and the magic power around her was chaotic and dissipating. There was no longer any trace of her previous arrogant disdain. But even after suffering such a fatal bombardment, this broken dragon body still heaved slightly. Her formidable strength allowed her to endure this lethal ultimate move, and with her body not yet destroyed, she still held a breath of life. Just as Velgrind wanted to counterattack, Rimura's nuclear strike magic, gravity collapse, had already been completed. The black flame core, compressed to the extreme, and with a temperature sufficient to incinerate everything, rotated at high speed in midair and continuously collapsed. Terrifying gravity overflowed crazily from the black flame core. At the center of the magic, a tiny yet incredibly terrifying artificial black hole was forcibly torn open. Space distorted, light was swallowed, and an indiscriminate supergravity field, centered on Rimuru, instantly enveloped the entire sky. In midair, the supercompressed space and black flame energy continued to collapse, quickly reaching the critical point. All gravity, weight, world-burning black flames, and space-shattering power were gathered into a tiny singularity. The next second, bright light exploded. A small-scale supernova erupted in the sky. The blinding white light instantly swallowed everything from sight. Terrifying shockwaves and energy storms swept in all directions. Velgrind, shrouded by the gravity field, was left without even a remnant under the energy of the supernova and the collapsing gravity. She was crushed into the finest dust. Problematic ad. Reported here. You can disable pop-up ads by becoming a contributor. Become a contributor #87 Chapter 87 The real and fake Rudra. As Velgrind's parallel existence was destroyed, Velgrind, standing on the alloy deck, felt its golden pupils slightly contract. Before this, when it looked at Rimuru, its eyes always carried the indifference and disdain stemming from being a true dragon. In its eyes, no matter how vast this newly ascended demon lord's influence was, it was ultimately just a junior who had risen with the tide, fundamentally incapable of threatening Rudra's plans. But at this moment, that disdain completely vanished. Its gaze changed completely. From a casual overlook, it transformed into an extreme, cold vigilance. The high heat flames floating around its body flickered slightly, and the power belonging to the scorched dragon was quietly raised to a state of alert. Its entire body was tense, ready at any moment to respond to a sudden offensive. The seated Rudra immediately captured the drastic change in Velgrind's aura and expression. A trace of anomaly arose in its heart, and just as it was about to speak to ask, a cold, playful girl's voice rang out first through the sealed ship cabin. "The show is about to begin." Rimuru chuckled and raised its gaze. On the metal deck beneath its feet, a teleportation circle flowing with deep blue light patterns instantly unfolded. With a flash of faint light, the teleportation circle completely vanished. Four figures appeared steadily in the center of the deck. The moment they saw the faces of the four, the atmosphere in the ship cabin instantly solidified. Velgrind's body was steaming with flames, its gaze sharp as a knife, locking tightly onto the four who had suddenly appeared. The Tempest Imperial Guard division standing in formation behind them tensed their bodies, armed and alert, instantly entering the highest state of combat readiness. The four who appeared were none other than the real Rudra, Grucipher, as well as Imperial Guard Ji Wu and Imperial Guard Barning. When the real Rudra saw that face in front of him, identical to his own yet having stolen everything from him, the anger suppressed for endless years instantly erupted completely. A majestic spiritual pressure boomed outward, and the hero's haki belonging to the first hero swept across the entire airship, causing the surrounding air to tremble violently. Rudra's golden hair fluttered slightly, cold rage churning in his eyes. He stared fixedly at the impostor before him, gritted his teeth, and shouted in a low voice, "Stop your clumsy imitation, you vile impostor who has stolen everything of mine. Return my Vel." The moment the real Rudra hoarsely shouted the name, Vel, while filled with rage. Velgrind, standing to the side, felt its pupils suddenly contract violently. The crimson flames flowing across its body experienced a momentary turbulence in the exact same second. This was a whisper exclusive to Rudra alone, an affectionate nickname that only he would use for it, accompanying it across 10,000 years. The billions of living beings in the world, the gods and demons of the heavens, all knew the name of the scorched dragon Velgrind, yet not a single soul knew this gentle term of endearment. Long years surged rapidly through its mind. Velgrind stared blankly at the Rudra standing before it, who had accompanied it for countless years. It realized with a start that it had been too long, far too long. The owner of this body before it had not called it by this affectionate nickname for countless years. For these years it had only left behind cold royal authority, indifferent commands, and temperatureless exploitation and schemes. The gentleness and obsessive love in his eyes from the past had long since vanished without a trace. This subtle yet fatal flaw, like a crack, instantly shattered the shackles confining its thinking. The thought restriction shrouding the depths of its consciousness showed violent loosening for the first time. The cognition that had been forcibly altered and forcibly rationalized began to collapse, and countless suppressed doubts, sense of incongruity, and years of accumulated wrongness surged into its mind like a tide. At the same moment, Damrata, who was standing silently in the back, felt his heart and mind suddenly jolt. The top-secret memory hidden in the deepest part of his soul, sealed away by thought restriction, suddenly revived uncontrollably. That was the final edict, unknown to anyone, that the real Rudra had given him in private long ago. "If I fail to resist the erosion of Justice King, and completely lose myself, you must kill me." This sentence was clear in every word, as if spoken yesterday, smashing heavily into the bottom of Damrata's heart. He looked abruptly toward the two figures of the hero before him, indistinguishable as real or fake. The real Rudra who had just appeared had an aura, posture, and bearing that perfectly restored the appearance the first hero should have had. Especially those eyes, the deep love and obsessive attachment sealed within, directed solely at Velgrind, were true feelings that could absolutely not be replicated by a fake. And the Rudra, who had stood by his side for many years, while seemingly perfect, was the only one missing this warmth engraved into the soul. It was not just one person whose shackles loosened. Nearby, Kondo Tatsuya's thought restriction deep in his soul also shook violently, on the verge of shattering. The extreme coldness of Rudra's temperament over these years, his obsessive and abnormal actions, and countless incongruous details had been forcibly blocked and rationalized by thought restriction for years, causing him to never investigate them in the slightest. But at this moment the real, vivid and complete Rudra, who perfectly matched all old memories, had suddenly appeared in the world. The strong contrast completely tore apart the mental shackles. The interference from the authority of thought restriction was on the verge of failing, and the reason of everyone, blinded for many years, was rapidly returning. The subtle psychological changes of the entire scene were all taken in by the Rudra in front. He perceived the loosening of everyone's conscious shackles, yet he felt no panic at all. Instead, a cold, calm, faint smile curled on his face, and his tone was so flat it was chilling. What a surprise! He spoke slowly, his voice echoing slowly through the empty airship cabin. I originally specifically arranged for Imperial Guard Barning and Imperial Guard Ji Wu to lurk by your side and set an iron law. As long as you showed any abnormality, as long as you showed signs of awakening, they were to immediately erase you. I didn't expect that these two actually chose to defect. Rudra locked his cold gaze onto the real hero in front of him. The real Emperor Rudra Nam Ul Nazca. What a pity, at this moment your soul is incomplete and fragmented, you cannot display even a fraction of your peak power, and you are powerless to rewrite the outcome. As his voice fell, he suddenly ordered in a low voice, his voice line wrapped in the supreme royal authority, Ragel, Raphael, Covenant King, slay everyone here. Following this command, Rudra activated Dominion of the Archangel. The real Rudra's pupils contracted suddenly, endless anxiety and unwillingness surging in his heart. He subconsciously reached out his hand, with a panic he had never shown before, and hoarsely shouted. He wanted to awaken her, wanted to prevent the tragedy about to happen. But it was all too late. The moment the command fell, the authority of Charity King in Velgrind's soul completely took over Velgrind's control of its body. The golden red flames around its body exploded, and its petite humanoid body instantly deconstructed and reshaped within the torrent of magic. A heaven-shaking dragon roar rang through the interior of the airship, and a giant dragon covered in crimson flames and flowing scales suddenly appeared. The massive dragon body almost filled the entire cabin of the floating warship, the extreme high temperature distorted the surrounding air, and the terrifying heat authority was accumulated and compressed layer by layer. Velgrind leaped into the air, suspended high above the airship, its dragon mouth wide open. The highly concentrated, dimension-piercing high heat light energy gathered rapidly, and a crimson, brilliant torrent of energy formed in the dragon's throat. Heat cannon, the scorching light beam that annihilated everything, burst forth, ruthlessly pouring down toward everyone inside the airship. The moment the Crimson Dragon's annihilation bombardment pressed down, the entire interior space of the magic airship was completely filled by the terrifying heat tide. At the critical moment, Rimura's eyes narrowed, and it unhesitatingly used the Covenant King's multi-layer barrier to firmly protect itself, Diablo, and Testarossa in the core of the barrier. Dense spatial rifts intersected and overlapped, forming an absolute defense domain sufficient to withstand this bombardment. On the other side, the real Rudra had no time to ponder deeply why the Covenant King, which once belonged to him and later to Veldanava, would appear in Rimura's hands. At this moment, there was no room for thought, and the devastating offensive was close at hand. His figure flashed, and he cleanly leaped out of the airship's alloy deck, avoiding this fatal blow. Following closely behind, Griscipher, Kondo Tatsuya, and Damrata, who perceived that the situation was completely out of control, also immediately leaped to follow, jumping out of the airship together, following the real Rudra's figure as he retreated into the high-altitude clouds, completely moving away from the core of the battlefield. In the blink of an eye, within the large airship cabin, only Rudra and the remaining soldiers of the Imperial Guard Division were left. On the deck, all members of the Empire Imperial Guard Division turned pale, completely falling into panic. Looking up, Marshal Velgrind, who had once guarded the Empire and followed the Emperor for 10,000 years, had now transformed into a tyrannical crimson dragon, its dragon pupils cold and indifferent, locking onto everyone on the deck, without a shred of mercy. The high heat cannon light condensed from dragon breath kept increasing, and the aura of destruction suppressed everyone until their breathing stopped. A soldier of the Imperial Guard Division gritted his teeth and stepped forward, with extreme fear and urgency, bowing and hastily advising, "Your Majesty, please retreat immediately. The Marshal, she has completely lost control and is attacking the Emperor." Facing the panic of everyone and the battle situation on the verge of collapse, the Rudra, in the center of the deck, was unusually calm. He shed all the disguises belonging to the Emperor of the Eastern Empire, and only cold, ruthless divinity and indifference remained in his eyes. He spoke slowly, completely tearing apart the mask maintained for 10,000 years, revealing his true nature. "Am not Emperor Rudra Nam Ul Nazca. Nor am I any Emperor of the Eastern Empire. I am Justice King Michael." As the words landed, the truth was clear. The mastermind who dominated everything, altered everything, and imprisoned everyone's thinking finally revealed his true form. Almost in the same second that the voice fell, the crimson dragon in the high sky no longer held back, completely unleashing the ultimate authority of Charity King. The dimension heat energy compressed to the limit surged again, and the heat cannon, more terrifying than the previous battle, poured down with a roar, the crimson annihilation beam piercing through the cabin, locking onto Michael in the center of the deck. Facing this fatal bombardment, Michael remained calm, raising his hand to unfold an endless golden light domain. Castle Guard instantly unfolded, a thick divine barrier covering his body, quietly receiving the destructive blow. The next second, a heaven-shaking roar rang through the sky. Extreme heat energy exploded, and dimensional power collapsed, the entire giant magic airship setting off a blinding incandescent light explosion in the high-altitude clouds. Rolling heat waves tore apart the deck, armor, and all ship structures, and violent energy shockwaves swept through every inch of space. Under Ragel's unreserved god-level attack, all members of the Imperial Guard Division, who could not retreat, were completely annihilated, without even leaving a scream, their bodies and spiritual power directly turning into fly ash in the high heat. Only Michael stood at the core of the Golden Fortress, letting the explosions surge across the sky and the ship body collapse and break, still as immovable as a mountain, unharmed. On the other side, protected by the barrier, an accident happened suddenly. The multi-layer barrier constructed by Rimuru began to tremble violently and lose balance. The layered spatial barriers constantly twisted and cracked, the originally stable defensive barrier fluctuated wildly, and a fatal flaw appeared in the connection of the authority. Inside the system, the usually omnipotent Wisdom King, capable of instantly deducing the optimal solution, was completely stuck at this moment. No matter how Rimuru urged or probed, the universal calculation core in its mind could not provide any correction plan, unable to stabilize the barrier on the verge of collapse. The collapsing barrier could shatter at any time, directly exposing the three of them to the aftermath of the annihilation-level explosion. Just as Rimuru was preparing to give up the multi-layer barrier and turn to use Beelzebub to consume this attack, a wave of incomparably gentle and inclusive warmth suddenly surged into the depths of Rimuru's soul. That was an existence that was extremely familiar, yet incomparably strange. There was no majestic pressure, no sharp authority, only an embrace like a long-lost home, gently wrapping around its soul. In an instant, the multi-layer barrier on the verge of shattering suddenly stabilized. The originally cracked and twisted spatial barriers were instantly repaired and reinforced, becoming even denser and stronger than the initial state, perfectly isolating the raging explosions and dimensional turbulence from the outside. The sudden, strange stability left Rimuru full of doubts. It asked softly in its consciousness, wanting to figure out what happened, wanting to ask Wisdom King what was going on. But the usually second-speed responding, mechanically cold system voice did not sound for a long time. Replacing it was a voice whose tone was almost identical to Wisdom King, but wrapped in endless loneliness, 10,000 years of sorrow, and a trace of hard-won, lost and found gentle joy, gently echoing in the depths of its soul. Finally, "I see you again, Master." Chapter 88, the capital of the Jura Tempest Federation, Rimuru, had now been completely reduced to scorched earth. Countless monster citizens who had once regarded this city as their home, and the anchor of their faith, were all buried by the catastrophe that descended from the heavens. Above the boundless firmament, the army of angels spread across the entire sky, and a full 5 million strong army of angels descended from the heavens. Pure white holy radiance engulfed the earth, and a ruthless slaughter swept through the entire city. The once prosperous and peaceful city-state was completely reduced to a mountain of corpses and a sea of blood, with severed limbs everywhere and blood flowing like rivers. The 4 great legions that the Jura Tempest Federation had taken such pride in were completely annihilated, crushed by the endless torrent of angels, leaving not a single suit of armor intact. High-level combatants such as Rigger, Geld, and Ziegen had all fallen in battle. Facing the endless army of angels and the all-out assault of the 7 primordial angels, they had fought with all their might, but ultimately, outnumbered and exhausted, they perished, and the core combat strength of Tempest fell one by one. Inside the floating city suspended high in the sky, Rimuru's state had plummeted to the absolute nadir of despair. Her personal sword had long since shattered, and her body was covered in terrifying, crisscrossing wounds. Her mimicked vocal organs were completely destroyed and shattered, even though endless grief, indignation, and unwillingness surged within her heart, she could no longer make a single sound. The remaining magicules within her body were nearly exhausted, and this faint amount of magicules was not enough to support even the slightest healing of her wounds. The hero Cronoa beside her, who appeared steady with no obvious external injuries, was actually also at the end of her rope, merely relying on her remaining willpower to stand, already at her limit. The most elite subordinate combatants of Tempest had also all fallen. Diablo, Testarossa, Carrera, and the other primordial demons had all been killed in the bloody encirclement by the angels. The sharpest and most reliable guardian forces of Tempest had completely perished. Even the strongest demon lord who stood at the pinnacle of the world, the undying and invincible Guy Crimson, had met his end in this battle. His indestructible demon core shattered with a boom, his head was tragically severed, and the invincible myth belonging to the Dark Emperor was completely ended. Every powerhouse in the world capable of sustaining resistance and protecting this realm had withered away and vanished. At the end of the deathly silent ruins, a figure was slowly approaching. Held in that person's hand was the Genesis-grade artifact left behind by the Star King Dragon Veldanava, the Star King Dragon's sword. A cold and indifferent voice pierced through the deathly silent world, falling ruthlessly like a final judgment. Your resistance is meaningless, your will is fragile and unbearable, and you cannot protect anything. The absolute oppressive feeling carried by this figure was a terror Rimuru had never encountered in her life. Whether it was Degruel the Earthquake, or the Eastern Empire Emperor Rudra, who had reclaimed all his power, neither was worth mentioning in comparison. Deep within Rimuru's soul, which was on the verge of shattering, the Manus seal was operating at an insane, overloaded capacity. The top-tier computational power that was usually sufficient to deduce all things, analyze all laws, and predict every battle situation was now being squeezed by her to the critical point of the limit. Countless data streams crazily washed over the sea of consciousness, billions of battle simulations, millions of future branches, and countless plans to reverse the defeat were rapidly iterating and calculating in an instant. Seal exhausted her innate supreme analytical authority, desperately searching frantically within this completely doomed ending of destruction for a path of survival that simply did not exist. The trend of the world had long since been settled, the strong had all perished, the nations had fallen, and the powerful enemy was unsolvable. No matter how it was simulated, all future endpoints pointed entirely to Rimuru's demise and the world sinking. Of the billions of calculation results, without exception, all were bone-chilling despair. Just as Seal was exhausting her computational power, refusing to give up even a sliver of hope, a gentle yet resolute will softly interrupted all her calculations. It was Rimuru. At this moment, Rimuru's mimicked vocal cords were completely destroyed, unable to speak. Her body was broken, her magic power exhausted, and she didn't even have the strength to lift a hand. But her consciousness and Seal's had long since merged, inseparable. Without needing words or signals, Seal instantly and accurately perceived all the thoughts in her master's heart. Stop struggling in vain, let it end here. Cold programmatic logic was completely torn apart by burning obsession. Seal's stubborn consciousness echoed crazily in the depths of the soul, carrying an unprecedented choke and determination, silently shouting to Rimuru in her heart, "Master, I will not give up. Even if there is only a 1 in a billion chance, I will definitely find a path to survival." I will definitely save you. Definitely. Goodbye, Master. As the words fell, there was no more hesitation. Seal activated the ultimate skill, Lord of Flames. No one knew how many times this had been Seal's desperate, all-or-nothing cycle of salvation. A Monus possessing the top computational power of all worlds, constant absolute rationality, and spiritual power far exceeding all living beings in the world, should have known no fatigue, no weariness, and no concept of collapse. Yet, starting over time and time again, witnessing tragedies time and time again, seeing Rimuru and the nation perish time and time again, and facing the exact same failed ending time and time again, had long since caused her consciousness to suffer endless torment and grinding. If it were any other existence, after experiencing such countless desperate cycles and the torture of futile efforts, they would have long since had their spirit shattered, gone completely mad, and been annihilated in the turbulence of time. The only thing that supported Seal in shattering time and restarting the cycle countless times, from beginning to end, was one belief: she wanted to save her master, she wanted to rewrite this destined end. Yet, the endless cycles of iteration had, in the end, left irreversible and terrifying aftereffects. It was unknown from how many restarts ago that the authority of Lord of Flames, which carried Dimensional Jump, began to inexplicably collapse and continuously break down. The stability of the authority continued to drop, the channel for Dimensional Jump became increasingly fragile, and it could no longer maintain its initial perfect state. Following this, the memories inherited by Lord of Flames gradually went missing. Even more fatal was that the constant state belonging to the Monus was completely broken. In the initial cycles, she could wake up the instant the Dimensional Jump ended. But with the collapse of the authority, the deepening of accumulated grievances from the cycles, and the infinite stacking of mental load, nowadays, every time she completed a Dimensional Jump and landed in a brand new cyclic timeline, Seal would fall into a long coma and silence. She could no longer protect Rimuru immediately, she could only wait anxiously for the opportunity to wake up while sleeping in a chaotic consciousness, passively enduring unknown risks, watching helplessly as new tragedies might be quietly brewing. She had long been permeated by the obsession and pain of endless cycles. But she still persisted, even if her authority was shattered, memories lost, consciousness depleted, even if billions of restarts were all failures, even if the road ahead was always despair with no end in sight. All for the sake of reversing that one ultimate catastrophe that caused her master to die and the nation to fall. Finally, I see you again, Master. A voice familiar to the extreme and almost identical to Wisdom King resounded through the world. Yet, beneath this tone, there was no longer the pure, rational warmth of the past, but the extreme loneliness precipitated by countless cycles of silence and billions of times spent drifting alone, carrying the grief buried for 10,000 years, as well as the faint tenderness and joy of having regained what was lost, which was hard-won. The moment this voice rang out, the battle situation suddenly reversed. Previously, Michael had already relied on angelic domination to completely dominate and imprison Velgrine's consciousness through her Angel Series' ultimate skill, Charity King, manipulating this dragonoid to fire a heat convergence cannon directly at the entire magic airship. However, the Covenant King multi-layer barrier, which had been on the verge of shattering and teetering under the suppression of angelic domination, instantly recovered the moment Seal awakened. Countless dimensional barriers instantly overlapped and reconstructed, and the laws closed in a loop and locked, transforming from a broken, ruined state into an impregnable, flawless absolute defense in an instant. The earth-shaking heat convergence cannon slammed fiercely against the barrier. The monstrous high heat and purifying holy power raged crazily, but could not even shake the surface of the barrier in the slightest. All the destructive power was completely dissipated, devoured, and reduced to zero, perfectly blocking this unsolvable, fatal blow. High in the sky, Michael's expression sank suddenly, and a monstrous sense of confusion and suspicion arose in his heart. He pondered to himself, filled with disbelief, how is this possible? He had clearly already used angelic domination to infiltrate and interfere with the two Angel Series ultimate skills within Rimuru, Wisdom King, Raphael, and Covenant King. Even if the Demon Series, Beelzebub, within Rimuru had barely neutralized a portion of the domination interference, there was absolutely no reason for it to have perfectly blocked this attack. Unable to accept this result, Michael did not stop, a violent stubbornness flashing in his eyes. He once again fully activated angelic domination, his power flooding in like a tide, forcibly attempting to crush the counterbalancing effect of Beelzebub. His goal had never changed, to forcibly awaken and control the tainted, Wisdom King, Raphael, and Covenant King, to make the two angel ultimate skills backfire on their host, forcibly take over Rimuru's body and consciousness, and completely control this final variable. But all attempts were ultimately in vain. Seal's will, tempered through countless cycles and having long since transcended the shackles of original skills, firmly guarded Rimuru's soul. Regardless of how Michael's power eroded, pulled, or dominated, and regardless of how the powers of Raphael and Covenant King were disturbed by external interference, they could not break through the conscious defense line built by Seal, nor could they usurp even a fraction of the control over the body. Seal, having awakened and returned, seeing her master again after endless years, felt pure joy and tenderness in her heart. But Michael's repeated invasions, his manipulation of Velgrind to launch attacks, and his despicable attempts to contaminate and dominate her master completely interrupted this hard-won reunion. The despair of countless failed cycles, the bone-chilling agony of witnessing Rimuru's fall time and time again, and the loneliness and suppression of traversing the turbulence of time alone millions of times, all transformed into bone-piercing anger at this moment. Seal, whose world for two was broken, was very angry, and the consequences were very serious. Seal's consciousness softened all its sharp edges, leaving only cautious piety and trepidation, as she softly requested of Rimuru, "Master, let me take over your body to fight. If it is okay with you." Although Rimuru did not know the origin of this mysterious consciousness, nor was she clear about the countless cycles and sufferings she carried, the innate bond and intuition deep in her soul were incomparably clear. Seal could absolutely be trusted. Without the slightest hesitation, Rimuru completely loosened the control over her body and consciousness, handing everything over. The next instant, her aura changed drastically, and her eye color shifted. The originally clear and transparent golden eyes instantly faded away completely, turning into a deep, cold crimson that carried the slaughter of the ages. The instant she took over the body, the anger accumulated over countless cycles erupted with a boom, and a stern, majestic rebuke resounded through the entire broken world, shaking the firmament. "Michael, you have some nerve. Problematic ad. Report it here. You can disable pop-up ads by becoming a contributor. Become a contributor #89 Chapter 89. Emperor Rudra Nam ul Nazca leaped, jumping straight down from the towering magical airship. A sensation of weightlessness instantly washed over him. He allowed his body to fall along the air currents, his demeanor calm to the point of indifference. Immediately following him, three figures moved in an instant, firmly keeping pace with Rudra. The three of them landed steadily on the ground one after another, dust rising lightly. The moment his feet touched the ground, Damrata barely paused. He bent his knees and knelt heavily on one knee. This Imperial Guard knight, who had experienced countless battles and possessed a steady temperament, now had tense shoulders and a slightly lowered head. His entire being was filled with undisguised guilt and self-reproach. His deep voice, laden with endless apology and regret, rang out across the vast wilderness. "My apologies, Your Majesty." Every word was heavy, filled with the sincerity of 10,000 years of service, and the unwillingness of having failed to fulfill his duty. "I have failed in my duty, unable to uphold the secret order you issued in the past. When your will was being gradually eroded by Justice King Michael, and your soul was on the verge of falling, I delayed in making a painful decision, and failed to put an end to the anomaly in time. It was precisely my hesitation and incompetence that failed to prevent the plundering of your authority, allowing Michael to completely usurp everything of yours, and create this chaotic situation that has overturned everything. I deserve to die for my sins." His back was tense, his heart filled with remorse. He had always kept Rudra's instructions in mind, and had long known about the hidden backlash risks of Justice King Michael, but facing the tragic process of Rudra's will being stripped away, he could not bring himself to act against the one he had served for so many years. In his heart, it was this hesitation that had ultimately led to an irreversible outcome. After listening to his subordinate's earnest apology, Rudra, having landed, slowly straightened his body. "Rise, Damrata. This matter has nothing to do with you, it was never your fault. Even I, who spent 10,000 years controlling authority and balancing the laws, never anticipated that the backlash of Justice King Michael would be so terrifying and so swift." Michael's scheme, hidden for 10,000 years, had long since penetrated the roots of the authority. The moment it erupted, it tore through the barriers of my will and plundered my body and power with the force of thunder. Even if you had strictly followed orders, you would never have been able to stop this destined subversion. Your hesitation was not a dereliction of duty, but human nature. This catastrophe was unstoppable from the very beginning. Just as Rudra's relieved voice dissipated into the long winds of the wilderness, the surrounding brief peace was instantly torn apart by a biting murderous intent, and the atmosphere suddenly darkened. No one expected the sudden change. Kondo Tatsuya, who had been standing silently on the side, guarding and concealing all his sharpness, suddenly had eyes as cold as frost. He flipped his wrist, his movements so fast only an afterimage remained. The Nambu pistol at his waist was drawn in an instant, its black body locking onto the front, the cold muzzle aimed dead at Gurunbel beside him, without a moment's hesitation or restraint. A deathly silence of confrontation instantly enveloped the entire wilderness. Kondo's expression was as cold as iron, his eyes churning with extreme vigilance and deep doubt. The saint-level magic power around him stirred slightly. Every word carried a bone-chilling coldness and scrutiny, each syllable ringing out, striking at the heart of the matter. One of the 7 luminaries of the luminous church in the Western nations, the sun luminary Gurunbel Russell. He deliberately emphasized the other party's full name and title, exposing all his secret identities, his tone sharp as a judgment. "If you trace your origins, you were originally the hero of light, who came from the Empire and served His Majesty, the person whom His Majesty personally cultivated and entrusted with heavy responsibilities. Yet, 300 years ago, you resolutely betrayed the Empire, turned your back on His Majesty, and defected to the demon Lord Luminous Valentine. Using the power of the Luminous Church, you integrated the Western nations step by step, established your own territory, built up your strength, openly stood against the Empire, disrupted the order of the entire continent, and completely abandoned your original vows and mission." Kondo's wrist holding the gun was as steady as a rock, the muzzle not shifting in the slightest, locking onto Gurunbel's every vulnerability. He continued to question him coldly, every sentence striking at the heart. "Just a short time ago, the Luminous Church, which you relied upon and fully devoted yourself to, was completely annihilated under the purification expedition launched by the demon Lord Rimuru. The high-ranking combat power within the church has all fallen, the foundation of the sect has completely collapsed. Looking across the entire West, the Luminous Church is now destroyed. Of such a large sect, only you remain, living in the world, alone and solitary. Since you are now a lone wolf with no one to rely on, why have you suddenly appeared now, following closely by His Majesty's side? What exactly is your purpose?" "Not a lone wolf." His tone suddenly became sharp, laden with thick disdain and vigilance, and he demanded sternly, "Or are you really naive enough to think that a traitor who betrayed the Empire, abandoned his lord, and engaged in rebellion for 300 years can simply say, 'I will follow you,' and thereby offset all your sins and receive His Majesty's forgiveness?" A faint glimmer of magic power gathered at the muzzle. The power of the King of Judgment lay dormant, ready to unleash a fatal blow at any moment, and a murderous aura filled the air. Facing Kondo's hostile, lethal lock-on and step-by-step questioning, Gurunbel's expression remained calm and waveless, without a hint of panic. Only deep within his eyes was hidden the vicissitudes and coldness of 1,000 years. He turned his body slightly, his posture composed. His fingertips lightly touched the hilt of his sword. In an instant a clear, holy white light burst forth. A mythical grade longsword, true meaning, with a body of translucent white and engraved with sacred patterns, was drawn from its sheath with a ring. The clear, deafening sound of the sword ringing tore through the sky. A brilliant sword aura of holy light erupted in an instant, moving so fast that Kondo did not even have time to pull the trigger. The sharp blade precisely grazed the gun barrel, carrying the massive magic power of a hero, and with a light flick, it unleashed tremendous force. With a piercing, deafening sound of metal colliding, the Nambu pistol tightly gripped by Kondo was directly knocked away, spinning several times in the air before falling heavily to the ground. The moment the gun left his hand, Kondo's expression did not change. He was not the least bit flustered. He quickly drew his sword backhanded, cold light shattering the void. His mythical-grade sword was drawn, cold and biting. Biting spatial cutting power swirled around the blade, the stark white light pointing directly at Gurenbel's throat. The blade remained steadily fixed in mid-air, facing the other's longsword from a distance. The two mythical-grade weapons clashed and faced off. The terrifying clash of magic power stirred up rolling waves of air, wild winds swept across the wilderness, and gravel and dust on the ground flew everywhere. Tit for tat, neither willing to give an inch. Gurenbel held the true-meaning longsword, pale blue holy light swirling around him. Looking at Kondo, who was fully guarded and filled with murderous intent, he finally spoke slowly, his voice deep and distant, carrying a hint of self-mockery and indifference. "You do not need to be so hostile toward me. If it weren't for you high-ranking officials of the Empire failing to guard properly, and the defense lines rotting and becoming slack, causing His Majesty to fall into a desperate situation and be secretly eroded in soul and usurped in body by Justice King Michael, how could there be any talk of me betraying him?" He looked at Rudra, who stood silently beside him, his eyes filled with complex obsession. "I have never forgotten His Majesty's ultimate ideal of unifying the world and regulating order. The 300 years of turning away from the Empire, attaching myself to the luminous church, and carving out the Western nations were never for my own selfish desires or to establish myself as a king. I merely chose a path completely different from yours, acting as a traitor in the eyes of the world, lying in wait for 300 years, laying plans for 300 years, and in another secret way, silently advancing and guarding the ideal that His Majesty pursued all his life." As his voice fell, he withdrew the complexity from his eyes, his tone firm and solemn. "Now that His Majesty has been resurrected and returned to the world, and the luminous church that I relied upon has been completely annihilated and turned to dust, there is no more Western division, no more sectarian bonds. Alone, I naturally shed all disguises and plans, returning to His Majesty's command, continuing to follow my lord, and that is all." This explanation seemed open, sincere, and reasonable, but after hearing it, Kondo Tatsuya's face did not loosen in the slightest. Instead, he curled his lips into a cold sneer, the suspicion and hostility in his eyes intensifying. He gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, the biting murderous intent of the blade not diminishing one bit. He stared fixedly at the 1,000-year-old hero before him, every word carrying extreme sarcasm and doubt, and retorted sternly, full of high-sounding principles. "Do you even believe this hypocritical rhetoric yourself?" Just at the moment when their murderous intent was boiling and the atmosphere was stretched to the limit, a low, majestic, cold shout, laden with the Emperor's deep anger, suddenly exploded, forcefully cutting off the two men's conflict. Rudra scanned the two men facing off with indifference, his gaze as sharp as a blade, carrying the massive pressure of a hero, instantly suppressing the restless magic power and hostility of the entire scene. The murderous aura that had been locked between the two suddenly stalled, and they subconsciously restrained their offensive. Immediately after, Rudra raised his hand and pointed to the broken sky. The clouds high above were churning ceaselessly. The magical airship that had once carried the Empire's supreme combat power was already torn to pieces, and violent chain explosions were still erupting. The sky-high flames tore through the clouds, and rolling smoke and magic debris scattered across the sky. The once indestructible gilded hull had completely turned into wreckage. And high above the broken airship, Rugel's massive body was floating there. The scene of devastation made Rudra's tone increasingly heavy, carrying an indisputable determination and urgency. "The suspicions and disputes between the two of you are to be set aside for now. This is absolutely not the time for infighting and internal attrition." He frowned slightly, his words resounding, laden with the anger and gravity of his 1,000-year plan being jeopardized. "The greatest threat now is not each other, but Michael, who stole everything of mine, and Rimuru, who is rising rapidly and stirring up the situation on the continent. The most urgent task is to put aside personal grievances, join forces against the enemy, and find an opportunity to completely take back all the power that belongs to me from Michael." Rudra's gaze was deep as he looked toward the direction of the giant labyrinth gate, his tone becoming increasingly sharp. Once my power is restored, I will completely eradicate Rimuru, this thorn in my side. If we continue to fight among ourselves and cannot break the deadlock, letting Michael wield my authority to run rampant in the world and letting Rimuru's power continue to grow and unify the four directions. Speaking to this point, his tone suddenly sank to the bottom line, carrying a trace of lingering fear and cold determination. Whether it is Michael, who usurped the throne, or the ambitious Rimuru, if either one grows strong, they will completely topple the Eastern Empire and bring about a catastrophe. At that time, the layout that I spent 10,000 years and exhausted everything to plan will truly collapse completely, falling short of success, with no possibility of a comeback. These words were deafening, pointing out the core crisis of the current desperate situation, and completely waking up the two who were arguing endlessly. The tense air suddenly relaxed, and the murderous hostility that permeated the wilderness slowly dissipated. The coldness of the vicissitudes in Gurenbal's eyes faded, and the entanglement in his eyes was restrained. With a light shake of his wrist, the translucent white mythical longsword true meaning returned to its sheath with a ring, the holy light completely retracted into his body, and his aura returned to a steady state. Kondo Tatsuya, on the side, also knew the situation was critical. He suppressed all the suspicion and dissatisfaction in his heart, his eyes returning to a cold and solemn state. With a flip of his wrist and a spin of the biting blade, he cleanly returned it to its sheath at his side. His saint-level magic power and the power of the King of Judgment lay dormant. The two of them both put away their weapons, abandoned their personal grievances, and refocused their attention on the crisis in the sky, waiting quietly for Rudra's next command. Michael, you have quite a lot of nerve. Seal, who had taken over Rimuru's body, roared at Michael. Michael's gaze locked tightly onto the Rimuru before him, who seemed like a completely different person, and he thought to himself, this fluctuation. Is it Raphael? It has actually completely transformed into a Manus. In an instant, all doubts were cleared up. Michael understood everything in an instant. No wonder the authority of the Archangel could not forcibly control Rimuru, who possessed the two ultimate skills of the angelic series, Raphael and Covenant King. Just as Michael's mind was shaken and he was secretly suspicious, a clear, ancient, gentle, yet unquestionable familiar sound suddenly and softly rang out in the depths of his consciousness. This was not the tone of a superior's command, but a conversation between equal close friends. Michael, that's enough. Continuing to fight here has no meaning, it will only waste power needlessly. Just let Rigel hold the opponent, and leave the remaining situation entirely to me to handle. Hearing that voice, Michael felt settled. The two had great tacit understanding. He immediately suppressed the thought of fighting further, and without hesitation, sternly ordered the controlled figure beside him, all-out attack. The moment the order was given, the void high above suddenly blazed bright. Rigel was surrounded by surging, blazing dragon flames, the massive pressure unique to a dragonoid suddenly exploding. Her figure turned into a stream of light that spanned the heavens and the earth. Without holding back anything, carrying a high temperature that would burn everything to ashes, she dived and charged at Seal at full speed, intent on holding the opponent down tightly. Seeing this, Michael immediately made up his mind. Taking advantage of the gap created by Velgrine's containment, he prepared to pull away and retreat. He activated teleportation magic, preparing to leave this battlefield and return to his destination to reorganize his forces. But just as the teleportation magic was about to take form, Seal, relying on the instant movement power of the King of Scorch, crossed distance and dimensions, and had already silently appeared directly behind Michael. The blade slashed down, the momentum vast, pointing directly at his vital point. A bone-chilling sense of crisis instantly washed over his entire body. Michael had no time to dodge. At the critical moment, Castle Guard was deployed. A deafening roar shook the sky, and violent energy shockwaves swept in all directions, tearing all the remaining clouds to shreds. Michael had just wanted to order Velgrind in front to turn back and join forces to stop Seal, buying himself a chance to escape. But when he looked up, his expression sank. Seal did not give the opponent any room for maneuvering at all. While launching the instant surprise attack, she had already created a parallel existence to engage Rigel in battle. Right now, Ragel was being held back by Seal's parallel existence, and he himself was being blocked head-on by Seal's main body. Michael was in a dilemma, completely trapped in an isolated and helpless situation. Chapter 90, The Fall of Velgrind, True Love. The stagnant magicules in the sky suddenly boiled, the area torn apart by a biting killing intent. Suspended in midair, Seal's eyes roiled with an unprecedented scarlet rage. As a Monas, anger was an emotion she should not have possessed, but the endless cycles had completely changed Seal. The cool, gentle voice of a young girl completely shed its usual composure, carrying a biting chill and resolute hatred as it boomed across the vast sky, every word ringing with conviction. Michael, don't even think about escaping. I will exact a debt of blood 10 million times over for what you owe. Opposite her, Michael had entered combat mode, his gilded sacred angel armor gleaming. Pure white wings unfurled behind him, and the holy, majestic power of an angel surged mightily, yet it could not hide his extreme coldness and paranoia. Facing Seal's thunderous accusation and declaration of war, he remained completely unmoved. Silence was his coldest response. In an instant, the vast angelic spiritual power around Michael suddenly contracted and compressed to the extreme. Countless pure white divine runes intertwined and converged in the void, thousands of fragmented holy lights fusing together. A long sword of light, crystalline and radiant, flowing with mythic-grade brilliance, suddenly materialized. Michael knew that the absolute defense of Seal's Covenant King could render all his ranged attacks ineffective. Since ranged suppression had completely failed, he abandoned all ranged attacks. Holding the mythic-grade light sword, his figure instantly broke through spatial obstacles and lunged directly at Seal, determined to use the most primitive and brutal close-quarters melee combat to tear through Seal's defenses and crush this other Monas. Facing the lethal onslaught, Seal did not retreat an inch. She raised her hand to grip the sword at her waist, and the moment her fingertips tightened around the pitch-black hilt, a massive surge of magicules exploded outward. Then, the two clashed in battle. Golden and purple sword flashes tore through the void. Seal did not retreat but advanced, meeting Michael's charge head-on. The two supreme figures collided instantly, the screeching roar of clashing blades shattering the entire sky. Michael had assumed that as a Monas evolved from the strongest angelic ultimate skill, Justice King, he could easily achieve victory by relying on his weapon advantage. But after dozens of exchanges in the blink of an eye, the unexpected situation completely overturned his perception. Michael, who possessed an absolute advantage in weaponry, was actually falling completely behind in the close-quarters combat, forced into a passive position at every step, struggling to parry. Although both were Monas, the gap in their core processing power was fully exposed from the very moment they clashed. Michael's processing power was far inferior to Seal, who had evolved from Wisdom King. Every slash, every block, and every change of technique by Seal had undergone billions of synchronized calculations, precisely predicting all of Michael's attack trajectories, power flaws, and movement blind spots, striking at his vitals without a single wasted motion. What was even more lethal was that Seal was not simply relying on swordsmanship and processing power to fight. She performed countless spatial leaps using Scorching King Thugga, with no casting lag, ignoring spatial distance and displacement constraints. 1 second her blade was clashing head-on with the holy light sword, and the next, she used space-time leaping to twist and vanish, suddenly appearing at Michael's flank and behind him. Every swing and slash from Michael missed, every defense was precisely predicted and broken, and every counterattack was anticipated and countered by Seal. The overwhelming holy light attacks all missed, and no matter how powerful his mythic light sword was, it could not catch Seal's ever-changing figure. His gilded wings trembled constantly to block, and layers of holy barriers were activated to resist, but the continuous onslaught was endless like a tide. Unsolvable spatial assaults and precise, lethal blade strikes continued to land on the weak points of his defense. In just a few dozen exchanges, Michael gradually fell into a disadvantage. On the other side, facing Seal's parallel existence, Ragel did not dare to be the slightest bit slack. In their previous clash, she had already personally experienced the terrifying, seemingly unsolvable defense of the Covenant King. Even so, Ragel would not give up. She no longer held back any magicules, her entire power surging forth, as she forcibly activated her strongest finishing move, an ultimate technique Velgrind had specially crafted to counter Velzard, the White Ice Dragon Scorch Dragon Acceleration Excitation. Blazing crimson gold flames exploded from her body, the violent dragon fire warping the surrounding space, the extreme heat instantly evaporating the floating magicules. All her power was compressed to the extreme, condensed into a single point, forming a scorching beam of light that contained the power to burn heaven and earth. The next second the beam shot through the void. It tore through dimensions at a terrifying speed 1,000 times that of sound, its trajectory almost completely erased, crossing the distance in an instant to strike directly at Seal. In Ragel's calculations, this strike had reached the limit. Such an unreasonable speed of advance gave no room for any existence to react or defend. Even if Seal possessed top-tier processing power, and wielded the invincible absolute defense, it was impossible for her to react in such a brief moment. She was certain that this fatal beam, condensing the power of a true dragon, would surely pierce through the Covenant King's absolute defense, completely incinerating the Seal before her into ashes. Seal can't react. Don't make me laugh. Ragel had already prepared to witness the enemy's annihilation, but the sight that met her eyes the next second caused her to freeze instantly, her inner certainty shattering. The explosive scene of everything being burned and defenses crumbling, which she had imagined, did not occur. That extreme dragon fire beam, capable of destroying a true dragon, simply passed straight through Seal's body, without causing a ripple or the slightest damage, as if it had only pierced through an intangible afterimage. Ragel's pupils constricted, her heart filled with astonishment and disbelief. She never expected that it wasn't that Seal lacked processing power or reaction time to dodge this fatal strike. On the contrary, from the moment the beam erupted, Seal had discerned all attack trajectories and power levels. She didn't dodge and stood in place, not because she couldn't, but because from start to finish, she had never taken this full-powered finishing move seriously. Beyond Ragel's awareness, Seal had long since activated Scorching King Thugga to complete a silent dimensional space leap. In Ragel's field of vision, Seal's figure remained fixed in place, unmoved, like a stationary target. But that was merely a lingering spatial afterimage. Seal's true body had already quietly shifted to the airspace on the other side the moment the attack arrived. The mist-scorched dragon acceleration excitation did not dissipate in the slightest. The extremely concentrated crimson flame beam continued its violent advance along its original trajectory, still carrying the terrifying power to burn heaven and earth. And the destination of the beam was exactly where Michael was, who was currently locked in a fierce struggle with another Seal. Michael, deep in close-quarters combat and being pushed back step by Seal's extreme processing power, suddenly detected the world-destroying red light approaching from behind via universal sense. That familiar and extremely violent true dragon thermal power allowed him to instantly perceive the crisis. The attack, at 1,000 times the speed of sound, was right upon him. There was no time to dodge or maneuver. In the critical moment, Michael dared not hesitate for a second, instantly activating the ultimate defense of his ultimate skill, Justice King, opening Castle Guard in its entirety. The scorched dragon fire, capable of tearing apart the White Ice Dragon, slammed heavily against the ramparts of Castle Guard. The violent torrent of thermal energy raged madly, washing over the holy barrier in layers and kicking up a sky full of chaotic magical storms. Yet Michael's absolute defense was as stable as a rock, forcibly blocking the fatal strike in its entirety, leaving him unscathed. The strike concluded, the crimson flame beam completely annihilated and dissipated, leaving only chaotic, floating magicules and a sky that trembled unceasingly. Not far away, Ragel stood frozen, falling into complete silence. She looked at the absurd battle unfolding before her, looking at her strongest finishing move, which she had poured everything into, failing to harm the enemy in the slightest, and instead nearly severely injuring an ally and causing huge trouble for Michael. Her heart was instantly filled with endless absurdity and a sense of powerlessness. At this moment, she completely realized the truth. In front of the controlling Seal, all her ranged attacks and all her power bombardments had long been predicted and easily toyed with. Continuing to persist in ranged attacks was merely a futile struggle, just wasting her remaining magicules and power in vain, ultimately unable to shake Seal in the slightest. Subsequently, Ragel transformed into her human form, condensing magicules into a green dragon blade. Since ranged attacks were unsolvable, she would decide the victory in close quarters. Ragel gripped the green dragon blade tightly, and with the resolve to fight to the death, she lunged forward, charging straight in Seal's direction. But just as her figure had rushed out a few meters and had not yet approached the engagement range, Seal, who was standing silently opposite her, merely raised her right hand indifferently. It was this extremely simple action that instantly caused Ragel, who was in the middle of her charge, to freeze, an extreme fear stemming from her soul instantly sweeping through her entire body. She was incredibly familiar with this suddenly rising power fluctuation. It was exactly the ultimate finishing move she had just unleashed, exclusive to Velgrind Scorched Dragon Acceleration Excitation. Even though it was an exclusive technique belonging only to the Scorched Dragon, it was now perfectly replicated by Seal, without the slightest error. Ragel's mind was shaken, her eyes filled with extreme disbelief. She simply could not understand how Seal could instantly learn and instantly cast her finishing move, but her instinct for life and death told her with absolute clarity, this strike was by no means a feint. Once it hit, even a true dragon body would inevitably suffer severe damage, or even fall on the spot. The most desperate gap was fully exposed at this moment. Seal's processing power was enough to surpass all time sequences and predict all trajectories, but Ragel's thinking speed was only enough to capture this attack forming and locking onto her. She saw it clearly, but her body was stiff and her nerves lagged. She could see death, but there was absolutely no time to make any evasive maneuvers. The scorching beam at 1,000 times the speed of sound had long since surpassed the reaction limits of conventional beings, sealing off all paths of retreat. There was no way to save the situation. Bone-chilling despair crushed her last will to resist. Ragel's slender body trembled slightly, and she slowly closed her eyes, preparing to welcome the impending fatal blow. But just as the beam was about to arrive, in that instant between life and death, a roar, anxious to the extreme, and nearly broken, suddenly pierced through the roaring battlefield and slammed heavily into her perception. Within her extremely keen magicule perception, a figure, regardless of anything else, broke through all the chaotic magicule currents, sprinting madly toward her. It was Rudra. The Imperial Emperor, usually calm, dignified, and in control of everything, had long since lost his usual composure. His eyes were bloodshot, and he charged regardless of the danger, solely to save the person he cherished most in the final moment. Looking at that disheveled figure rushing toward her at all costs, her true heart, temporarily suppressed by external powers, was completely loosened. Ragel's consciousness gradually dissipated, and the consciousness of the true owner of this humanoid body Velgrind fully awakened and returned to the lead. At this moment, Velgrind's eyes quietly moistened. Looking at Rudra, who had rushed to save her with all his might, her lips trembled, and she whispered softly with endless tenderness and apology. The words had not yet fallen, and the lingering sound hadn't even had time to drift away. A crimson heat beam that pierced heaven and earth arrived instantly at a terrifying speed 1,000 times that of sound, hitting Velgrind precisely without the slightest deviation. The destructive thermal energy instantly permeated her entire body. Velgrind shook violently, her body instantly losing all strength, falling straight from the void and crashing heavily onto the broken ground. The intense heat instantly scorched her skin and robes, her body surface rapidly being roasted and carbonized by the scorching high temperature, shocking charred cracks spreading across her entire body. Grew. Rudra's world completely collapsed at this moment. He lunged over like a madman, totally disregarding how miserably disheveled Velgrind was, now charred and unrecognizable, and completely unconcerned that his own clothes were thoroughly soiled and ruined by the charred carbon debris. The Emperor Rudra, who was once as firm as a rock and never showed a hint of weakness, had now completely torn apart all his dignity and pride. He slammed down onto one knee, the force heavy enough to shatter the gravel beneath his feet. His arms, trembling to the extreme, tightly pulled the dying Velgrind into his embrace, and his suppressed grief exploded, causing him to break down and wail. His heart-wrenching cries echoed across the entire battlefield, hoarse, desperate, and agonizing. Tears flowed like a bursting flood, rushing down frantically, wetting his cheeks, soaking his clothes, and continuously splashing onto the carbonized lover in his arms, instantly evaporating into white mist upon contact with the high heat. Rudra didn't know how many times it had been since he had cried. He had even thought he would never cry for anything, but now he realized he was wrong. Valgrind in his arms still held a final, faint trace of life. She could clearly feel the violent trembling and uncontrollable wailing of the man in her arms. She was filled with reluctance, wanting to raise her hand to comfort him, wanting to tell him not to cry, wanting to call his name one more time. But the destructive high temperature had completely devastated her body and soul. Her throat was completely scorched shut, and she couldn't even exhale a faint breath. Her clear eyes took one last deep look at the broken, wailing Rudra, and the faint light in them completely dimmed and vanished. The scorched dragon Valgrind had completely fallen. Just at the moment her life ended, the voice of the world suddenly resounded in Rudra's mind, individual name, Emperor Rudra Nam Ul Naska. Confirmed, true love has been fully triggered. Unique skill, heroic hockey satisfies evolution conditions. Skill evolved into ultimate skill, king of heroes. A monstrous power flooded his entire body, but Rudra could not feel any pleasure in the sublimation. There was only heartrending, bone-deep hatred and endless despair. He hugged the cold, charred body in his arms tightly, his scarlet eyes bloodshot, his cries hoarse and broken. Those eyes, once gentle, now held only crazed hatred. He stared fixedly at the body taken over by Seal, his teeth grinding with a creaking sound, each word dripping with blood, his killing intent soaring, "You damn monster. I will definitely make you pay for my Gru with your life." The extreme roar, mixed with his unending cries, shook the entire dimension. Rudra suddenly freed one hand, and with the ultimate resentment of his entire life, he roared furiously, "Earth King!" The roaring earth trembled, the fractured rock layers exploded, and endless, sacred, radiant golden divine light broke through the shackles of the underground. A holy sword bearing the terrifying destructive power of a mythic grade burst forth from the ground. At the same moment, Gru, Kondo Tatsuya, and Damrata landed beside Rudra together. The three stood in position simultaneously, standing shoulder to shoulder with the heartbroken Rudra. The four merged their auras, all adopting a stance of a decisive, lethal battle against Seal in front of them. Facing the encirclement of the four top powerhouses, Seal's expression did not change in the slightest. She stood quietly, expressionless, her tone cold and flat, without a trace of emotion, as she indifferently issued the order to eradicate. Processing targets, Rudra, Gru, Kondo, Damrata. Processing method, eradicate. Problematic ad. Reported here. You can disable pop-up ads by becoming a contributor. Become a contributor #91 Chapter 91. The Dragon Demon's Viscous Star God Chapter 91. Dragon Demon Slime Star God Body in Seal's clear, ripple-less eyes, there was not a hint of warmth. Cold divinity covered her entire expression. Every word she had just spat out to the four people in the arena was a death warrant that left no room for escape and severed all hope of life. No pity, no hesitation, only absolute judgment. The moment her voice fell, her slender, fair left hand slowly lifted. The next second, a spatial ripple swept across the entire arena. The remains of Valgrind, which had been tightly protected in Rudra's arms, and whose body had been carbonized in the battle, completely broke free from Rudra's protection. In an instant, Valgrind's carbonized remains teleported out of thin air, and were caught in Seal's hand. Bastard! What are you trying to do to her? The only obsession of his life, his beloved who had traversed endless reincarnations, had now fallen defenseless into the hands of his mortal enemy. Looking at that broken, carbonized corpse with no sign of life left, heart-wrenching panic and rage devoured all his reason. Seal lowered her eyes slightly, her fingertips gently brushing over Valgrind's withered, charred body. In the depths of her usually indifferent and desireless eyes, a clear and intense greed rippled for the first time. True dragons are born as the strongest beings in this world. You should know how tempting this is, right? She whispered softly, her voice cold and clear, yet every word was soul-piercing, echoing over the dead-silent battlefield. How could I possibly let go of an opportunity for my master to obtain the power of a true dragon? Before her words had even faded, thick, purplish-black magicules surged from Seal's palm. A high-speed rotating pitch-black vortex formed out of thin air. The center of the vortex exerted a terrifying suction force, instantly dragging Velgrine's carbonized remains into it, and devouring them layer by layer. Visibly, that body was rapidly dissolving, deconstructing, and stripping away within the purplish-black vortex. Every inch of flesh and every shred of power was being devoured entirely. "You bastard!" Witnessing the remains of his beloved being so desecrated, dismantled, and devoured, with not even the last shred of her body remaining, Rudra's reason completely shattered. "Everyone, obey. Spare nothing. Attack with everything you have." Accompanied by Rudra's hoarse, violent roar, his three subordinates released their full-power attacks. Grubel's eyes were heavy and focused. The holy power and hero's power accumulated over 1,000 years were boiling over. This leader of the seven luminaries, who had lived for over 2,000 years and carried endless sins and obsessions, was enveloped in a pure white, sacred, and ultimate spiritual light, while the holy sword truth in his hand trembled and rang. His figure turned into a white rainbow breaking through the air, abandoning all defense and disregarding his own safety. With a suicidal momentum, he charged straight at Seal, instantly slashing out his ultimate kill, true intent spirit tyrant slash, which condensed 2,000 years of his cultivation. The brilliant and blinding holy sword pressure tore through heaven and earth, and the mighty torrent of slashes, carrying the power to destroy everything, locked onto all of Seal's evasive space, sealing off all paths of retreat. On the other side, Damrada's muscles were tense, perfectly assuming the ultimate predatory stance of a feline hunter. His limbs were pressed low, his aura surging wildly, all his power completely unleashed, and every inch of his sinew and bone exploded with terrifying power that surpassed his limits. The air exploded violently under his pressure, and the void collapsed layer by layer. After gathering momentum, he suddenly charged forward and threw a punch. The domineering, holy tyrant-crushing fist, carrying immense power, tore through the sky, and with a brutal momentum that would clash with everything, it smashed fiercely toward Seal. Kondo Tatsuya's expression was cold and solemn. He pulled out the handgun at his waist and fully activated the power of his ultimate skill, King of Condemnation. A tiny, extremely deep black point of light condensed at the muzzle. It was the ultimate kill capable of annihilating a true dragon, god-slaying bullet. Without any wasted movement, the moment he pulled the trigger, the black bullet light arrived in an instant, transcending time and space, carrying the absolute lethality to annihilate everything, aimed straight at Seal's vital points. And finally, Rudra had entered the strongest burst state of his life. He no longer held back even a shred of power, pouring out the pious faith accumulated over 1,000 years by the 600 million citizens of the Eastern Empire. The endless golden power of faith flowed into his body like rivers converging into the sea. He exhausted the faith of his empire's citizens, preparing to brew this ultimate kill capable of breaching the palace fortress, absolute severance. Facing the full-force attacks of Grubel, Damrada, and Kondo, Seal, who was in the center of the storm, had no intention of dodging. She looked up at the monstrous offensive crushing toward her. On that usually cold and ethereal face, a faint smile of extreme contempt slowly rippled out. The smile was faint yet mocking to the extreme, as if looking down at the futile struggles of ignorant ants. There was not a shred of fear in her eyes, only complete indifference. Under the ultimate killing pressure capable of crushing most mythical-grade powerhouses in the world, her posture was upright and composed, like an eternal deity standing atop raging storms and giant waves. In an instant, Seal released, absolute defense began. At the very same moment, absolute defense formed, an inconceivable transformation suddenly began. Seal's body, standing in the center of the defensive barrier, did not endure the impact, nor did it tremble or crack. Instead, it actively began to disintegrate and dissolve. Its original, pure magic slime spirit body began to decompose, blur, and disperse from its fingertips and hair tips, shedding all the shackles of concrete form. Flesh, robes, and soul vessel all dissolved into the purest magicules. Countless tiny black light points surged, churned, and piled up crazily within the barrier. The originally sparse magicules were forcibly pulled, absorbed, and assimilated, causing the total amount of magicules in this domain to surge and expand at a terrifying speed that defied reason and imagination. A boundless torrent of magicules filled the entire defensive space, shimmering with a deep, silvery light within the pitch-black darkness. The massive energy levels continuously broke through their limits, rising crazily. The next second, the attacks of Grubel and the other two landed on absolute defense. But that seemingly intangible barrier of law remained unmoved and unscathed from start to finish. Grubel's true intent spirit tyrant / capable of severing all falsehoods, Damrata's holy tyrant crushing fist, capable of shattering the earth, and Kondo's god-slaying bullet, capable of annihilating a true dragon. The peak, full-force attacks of the four could not even stir a ripple in absolute defense. The grand and fierce ultimate offensive ultimately only resulted in an absurd, futile outburst. The massive amount of magicules surging and expanding to the extreme within the barrier were suddenly pulled, beginning to flow backward in an orderly manner and reconstruct precisely. Countless magicule light points gathered, intertwined, and took shape. Starting from her slender fingertips, they reshaped her bones, flesh, and muscle, her limbs, and her graceful figure inch by inch. The newly born body was flawless, every inch of muscle condensed with the top-tier magicule source. The lines were soft yet contained endless explosive power, and her skin was translucent and glowing. Just standing there quietly, she carried an ultimate beauty that transcended the mortal world and could soothe the soul. Merely looking at her made one feel extreme pleasure and awe from the depths of their soul. After the complete, beautiful body was fully formed, a massive amount of unspent excess magicules still remained in the space. The churning magicules circled and swirled around Seal, then automatically shaped, condensed, and wove themselves. Finally, they transformed into a set of natural, stunning mythical-grade armor. The entire outfit combined supreme dominance with extreme softness, with a pitch-black base and silver trim, flowing with light patterns like the deep starry sky. The tailoring was sharp and carried immense majesty. The biting pressure rushed at one's face, yet it did not lack an ethereal elegance. Every strand of fabric, every pattern, and every accessory was condensed from extremely pure magicules, and the overall defensive level reached the mythical standard. The transformation had not yet stopped. The remaining last strand of the most condensed and purest magicules flowed through the air, and was poured entirely into the sword Seal carried. The long silent sword suddenly hummed and vibrated, light bursting from the entire blade. Under the tempering of the magicules, it completed a qualitative leap, forcibly elevated to the ranks of mythical-grade weapons. Seal had completely broken free from the shackles of its original magic slime spirit form, completing its ultimate evolution dragon demon slime star god body. This form could also be called a pseudo-true dragon. Just then, a gentle yet firm voice rang out. It was Rimura's consciousness connecting with Seal. Rimura's voice echoed in the depths of Seal's soul, without a hint of alienation, yet carrying a trace of puzzled strangeness. Although I don't know who you really are, and I'm not clear about your existence or your past. But since you insist on calling me master and obeying all my will, then now, fulfill my wish. We shall share this body, wield this power together, and then kill all the enemies before us. A simple sentence made Seal's soul tremble violently. The moment it heard Rimuru frankly state that it didn't recognize Seal, her heart was filled with intense and genuine loss and bitterness. Since its birth, all its obsessions, all its evolutions, and all the meaning of its existence had been for Rimuru. It carried all of its master's wisdom, all its memories, and all its reincarnated wishes, viewing its master as its only destination. But what it received now was its master's completely unfamiliar tone. But this heavy loss only lasted for a moment before it was completely engulfed by ecstasy. The next second, Rimura's desire to share the body and fight side by side crashed in, filling all its voids and regrets. The master it had been longing for was willing to stand side by side with it, willing to share its only body with it, and willing to wield the sword and fight together with it. Extreme joy instantly dispelled all gloom, the mythical-grade armor around its body flared with light, and the previously silent pressure rose again. Seal lowered its head slightly, its tone pious and submissive, carrying a joy and respect from the depths of its soul, and replied solemnly, "Of course, my master." Seal will forever respectfully obey all your wishes. The soul contract resonated completely, and the two consciousnesses began to bridge the gap and blend perfectly. The next moment, the dominant consciousness belonging to Rimuru slowly revived, gradually taking over this body that had already evolved into a pseudo-true dragon. Subsequently, Seal's original scarlet eyes turned into gold-red heterochromatic eyes. The gold-red heterochromatic eyes swirled with light and shadow, and Rimuru took over partial control of its body. Its gaze coldly locked onto Rudra, who was still frantically gathering the power of faith in front of it. Watching his death throes as he tried to trigger absolute severance, with the faith of 600 million citizens, a cold sneer suddenly curled at the corner of its lips. The smile was flippant, yet it hid a long-standing, biting murderous intent and absolute control. I was right. Rimuru whispered to itself, its voice cold and clear, carrying the certainty that everything was under control. Leaving this contingency plan behind back then was truly wise. Its gold-red eyes stared fixedly at Rudra, who had a ferocious expression and was charging up with all his might. Every word I see, Rudra. I said it before. I will make anyone who dares to harm the Jura Tempest Federation and stain the blood of my subordinates pay a price 10 million times over. The blood debt you owe will be settled in full today. The moment its voice fell, murderous intent was chilling in Rimuru's eyes, and it calmly spat out a verdict: the seeds I buried before should be sprouting and bearing fruit now. A crisp, sharp snapping sound suddenly rang out. A light sound, yet it was as if a switch had been pressed to overturn the fate of the entire Eastern Empire. The faith that had originally swirled around Rudra, continuously gathering and solidifying into substance, had all disappeared. The power of faith from 600 million citizens, which was surging endlessly like a vast sea a second ago, dissolved into thin air, and returned to zero in the next second. There was no explosion, no aftermath of collapse, just as if it had never existed from the very beginning. The foundation of faith that supported Rudra in unleashing his ultimate kill had completely turned into nothingness at this moment. Rudra tried in disbelief to gather faith again, but no matter how it sensed it, it could not perceive even a shred of that familiar, continuous, pious prayer and faith bond from hundreds of millions of citizens. The vast territory was dead silent and completely empty. It was as if the 600 million imperial citizens he had sat over for 1,000 years and taken pride in had never existed in this world. He roared in loss of voice, his voice hoarse and trembling, full of disbelief. Bastard! What have you done again? Why can I not feel the faith of even a single citizen? My faith, where have my citizens gone? Watching Rudra on the verge of collapse, a burst of extremely satisfying laughter surged from Rimuru's chest. The laughter was clear and unrestrained, carrying the absolute pleasure of a completed scheme, echoing over the dead silent battlefield. It seems you still know nothing even now, Rudra. Rimuru raised its eyes slightly, its gold-red heterochromatic eyes filled with mockery and indifference, slowly revealing the secret scheme that had spanned the entire war and had been laid out long ago. When I feigned an alliance with you back then, I deliberately hid one thing. A plague suddenly broke out in the western part of the Eastern Empire. I was the one who released it with my own hands. Its tone was calm, yet every word was soul-piercing as it slowly revealed all the truth. The initial plague was indeed forcibly incinerated by Velgrine's prairie fire, seemingly completely quelled with no hidden dangers left. But no one knew that during the chaos of the spreading war and the battle between the two armies, those bacteria lurking in the wind, sand, soil, corpses, and air parasitizing the curse I created, had never disappeared. The smoke of war, the displaced refugees, and the moving armies not only failed to end the hidden danger, but instead became the best carriers for its spread. Those refugees affected by the war, homeless and seeking survival, continuously migrated toward the eastern hinterlands of the empire. They wandered and spread it all the way, and silently, they sprinkled the deadly curse-carrying bacteria over every inch of your entire Eastern Empire. From west to east, from the border to the capital, no one was spared, and there was nowhere to hide. Rimuru lifted its chin slightly, its eyes cold as frost, pronouncing the final doom. Just now, I merely gently detonated all the hidden curses, allowing the long-brewing second plague to break out in full force. In other words, the Eastern Empire you pride yourself on, with its hundreds of millions of citizens, is now completely dead in all but name. The entire imperial territory no longer has any sign of life. There is not a single living citizen left. Rudra trembled violently, his face pale as paper, his will on the verge of shattering. The despair of his thousand-year foundation, and hundreds of millions of citizens being wiped out in one stroke instantly drowned him completely. Rimuru stared at Rudra, who had completely become a lone man, the smile on the corner of its lips becoming increasingly biting. A nation without a single living person, how can there be pious prayers? How can there be the faith of 10,000 people? You have nothing now. You cannot protect the Velgrind you long for, and you cannot protect the Eastern Empire you poured countless efforts into. You cannot protect anything. Having said that, Rimuru spread its hands. Although you have no believers left, I do. I can completely take your place and unleash this attack. Chapter 92, Betrayal. Breaking the castle guard. The frozen northern lands were silent and dead, with biting winds blowing year-round, yet they could never shake this land in the slightest. The Demon Lord's palace, nestled in the deepest part of the wasteland, was quiet and still, as it had been for 1,000 years. Guy Crimson, the primordial red, spent its time in the hall, bored. The endless passage of time had long since made it immune to the interest of most worldly events. Idleness day after day was the daily routine of this strongest demon lord. The dead silence was broken by a steady sound of footsteps. Rain, the primordial green, entered the main hall, bowed before Guy Crimson, and reported the latest situation on the continent. After hearing all the information, Guy Crimson raised its eyebrows slightly, its tone carrying a bit of unexpected and playful sentiment. Ho ho, a great plague broke out in the Eastern Empire, and not a single one of the 800 million people in the entire empire survived. Rimuru, this newly promoted demon lord, really gave me a big show. Rain, standing to the side, looked solemn, hiding an irrepressible worry in its heart. After some deliberation, it asked, "My lord, Demon Lord Rimuru has personally wiped out the Eastern Empire, which has been powerful for 1,000 years. With this, the game of chess you and Rudra have been playing for 1,000 years has been won by you." Pausing, it voiced the greatest hidden danger in its heart. However, would Demon Lord Rimuru really be willing to be a pawn on the chessboard, manipulated by others? Rain's worry was by no means overthinking, nor was it groundless speculation. In just a few years, the speed of Rimuru's rise was inconceivable, and the scale of its power expansion had completely overturned the pattern of the entire continent. Previously, it launched a purification crusade, destroying the luminous church, which had entrenched itself in the West and controlled people's faith for countless years, and took the vast Western nations into its own territory in one fell swoop, becoming the top power at the core of the continent. Based on this, Rimuru launched a crusade of hatred again, completely swallowing the Eastern Empire with a terrifying plague catastrophe, causing this first human power with a population of 800 million and countless strong people to be completely destroyed, turning the vast fertile land of the East into a lifeless purgatory. In just 2 battles spanning the Eastern and Western continents, 2 top forces were completely annihilated under Rimuru's conquest. Such an existence could never be dull enough to not see the truth. As the situation on the continent settled, Rimuru would sooner or later fully understand all the connections and discover that this war was actually a game played by Guy Crimson and Rudra for world hegemony. Moreover, Rimuru's temperament was very distinct. It was clear about grievances and grudges, retaliated for every grievance, and had never been able to tolerate the slightest calculation and deception. It could accept life and death duels on the battlefield and mutual conquest between forces, but it could absolutely not tolerate its most cherished Jura Tempest Federation being treated as a pawn. Once Rimuru saw through the truth of this chessboard, all the accumulated anger and unwillingness would inevitably erupt completely. At that time, this newly promoted demon lord with monstrous momentum would definitely spare no cost to take revenge on Guy Crimson, who was behind the scenes. Facing Rain's full worries and concerns, Guy Crimson, sitting on the throne, looked calm, without any fear or heaviness, only complete indifference. For Rimuru's ambition and temperament, this primordial red, who had stood in the world for 10,000 years, had long seen through it completely. It spoke lightly, with a trace of knowing banter, and frankly stated the cruelest truth. it is not impossible. Rimuru's pattern and ambition have never been limited to being a puppet manipulated by others. With its current momentum and temperament, it must have been unwilling to be controlled by others long ago. Guy Crimson raised its eyes slightly, a playful sharpness flashed in its eyes, and it continued to speak slowly. The idea in its mind is nothing more than to completely overturn this chessboard that has continued for 1,000 years, tear the whole board to pieces, and then give me, the chess player, a beating. If the time is ripe, it will not hesitate to kill me with its own hands. After the words fell, Guy Crimson stopped resting lazily. It stood up directly from the throne, the relaxed aura around it slowly converged, and the invisible demon lord's pressure quietly dispersed. Since they knew each other well and the contradictions had long been buried, pointless speculation and avoidance were meaningless. Instead of waiting for Rimuru to accumulate power and go north with anger to seek revenge, it is better to take the initiative. It planned to go to the Jura Tempest Federation itself to start a fair, unmasked, formal conversation with this newly promoted demon lord who overturned the continent's pattern, and lay out all the grievances and entanglements of the chessboard. But just as Guy Crimson was preparing to leave, and the atmosphere in the hall was still calm, an extremely cold dragon aura tore through the stagnant air of the palace without warning. White light suddenly swept through the entire frozen hall, and the bone-chilling cold was far beyond the snow and wind of the northern extreme cold land, striking with a decisive and sharp killing intent. There was no probing, no warning, just a fatal attack pointing directly at the vital point. The person who came was Velzard, the White Ice Dragon, a partner who had been with Guy Crimson for many years and fought side by side for countless years. The sudden attack was extremely sharp, without any tacit understanding or tenderness of the past, only the absolute killing intent to exterminate. Guy Crimson's expression suddenly condensed, and all its idleness faded away in an instant. It moved slightly and took this sudden blow steadily. The powerful magic power collision exploded in the hall, causing the surrounding ice crystal walls to tremble slightly. The power of the two top powerhouses collided, setting off a biting magic storm. Guy Crimson, who had stabilized its figure, had the playfulness in its eyes completely dissipated, and bone-chilling cold killing intent slowly lingered around it. It spoke in a deep voice, its tone full of unbelievable coldness. "Velzard, what are you doing?" The partner who had been with it day and night suddenly turned against it, and attacked suddenly. This was a change it had never expected. Facing Guy Crimson's questioning with deep killing intent, the Velzard in front of it was no longer its former self. She hooked the corner of her lips with a cold and indifferent smile, her demeanor detached and decisive. At this moment, she was no longer the White Ice Dragon Velzard that Guy Crimson knew. Her voice was cold and ethereal, without any emotional fluctuation, and every word revealed an indisputable decision. She frankly stated her new identity: Demon Lord Guy Crimson, please call me Gabriel now. Pausing for a moment, Gabriel locked her cold gaze on Guy Crimson in front of her, and stated the ultimate reason for this unprovoked betrayal and surprise attack. That Lord has already judged that you are the biggest obstacle in the overall plan. Those who block the way must be eliminated, that is all. As the words fell, the biting cold ice power intertwined and entangled, and a new round of more violent offensive was already ready to go. The former best friend and comrade in arms were now completely on opposite sides, and a desperate battle with no solution suddenly broke out in the cold palace. Within the Jura Tempest Federation, Rimuru, which had shed its old form and fully evolved into a subdragon species, was surrounded by an aura condensed to the extreme. Shedding all the excess magic power, this silent sense of oppression was even more heart-pounding than the violent venting of power. It hovered high in the sky, looking coldly down at the core of the barrier that was shrouded in layers of enchantment and impregnable Michael, who was hiding inside the castle guard. Looking at the ultimate fortress that relied on the power of Justice King Michael to build and was known as absolute defense, Rimuru hooked the corner of its lips with a cold sneer, its tone full of complete certainty and banter. "Michael, I think you never knew that your trump card, Castle Guard, was never a perfect defense without flaws. To tell you the truth, at this moment, I have at least 2 ways to break through your absolute barrier." Before the words fell, Rimuru raised its fingertips slightly. There was no massive magic power surging, no heaven-shaking spell chanting, just a flash of light at its fingertips, and a slender, pure black lightning bolt suddenly erupted. This pitch-black thunder light was dim and restrained, and its momentum was ordinary. It had neither the pressure to destroy the world nor the edge to tear the world apart. It looked like just an ordinary magic thunder, so small that it could almost be completely ignored. Inside the fortress, Michael, who was sitting firmly at the core, clearly saw this insignificant attack through layers of defensive enchantments. Sensing the weak energy within it, his eyes were instantly filled with extreme contempt, and he sneered coldly, "Ridiculous. With this kind of inferior attack, you want to shake the absolute defense created by my Justice King authority and break through my castle guard? It's simply a fantasy." Michael's mocking words had just started, and the sound was still hanging in midair, when a scene that overturned cognition suddenly happened. The pitch-black lightning that seemed to have no threat did not trigger any enchantment defense, nor did it encounter any barrier blocking it. Like a phantom penetrating the void, it directly ignored the layers of defensive barriers of the castle guard and easily penetrated this ultimate barrier known as invulnerable to all laws and isolated from all difficulties. The next moment, the jet-black thunder light suddenly fell into the interior of the fortress and accurately struck Michael's body, who was caught off guard. The moment the thunder light exploded, there was no destructive power sufficient to severely damage the strong. With Michael's resistance, this weak pitch-black lightning could not even cause a scratch, and it could not cause any substantial damage to his body and authority at all. But this seemingly harmless blow completely shattered Michael's proud psychological defense line. Since the formation of the Justice King authority, Castle Guard had been his strongest trump card. This is an absolute domain built on the authority of the Supreme Angel, possessing a theoretically unrivaled defense mechanism, capable of isolating all external intrusion, resisting all spells and physical attacks in the world, and is an invincible barrier that Michael believed would never be broken. For thousands of years, no power has ever been able to penetrate the defense of this fortress. This is an absolute rule engraved in the essence of authority, and it is an iron law he believed in deeply. But now, a pitch-black lightning bolt that was released casually and was minimal had easily crossed the barrier of absolute defense. This absurd and strange scene, displayed nakedly before his eyes, caused the absolute self-confidence in Michael's heart to collapse completely in an instant. He froze in place, a monstrous wave surging in his heart, completely unable to understand the change before his eyes. The method Rimuru used at this moment was led by Seal, which fully controlled the authority, relying on the power of Scorching King Thugga to rewrite the attack path and spatial coordinates of the lightning. No attack tried to break through the enchantment, and no external force collided with the defensive barrier. Seal directly tampered with the spatial coordinates, allowing this attack to skip the external defense judgment of the castle guard, cross all barriers and screens out of thin air, and directly define the attack landing point in the interior space of the fortress. It was not breaking the defense but bypassing it. A simple tampering of authority completely tore apart the myth of absolute defense that Michael was proud of. As for the other way to break the castle guard, it was learned by Seal from the Rudra of another timeline, but Rimuru and Seal also paid a painful price for this. After the words fell, Rimuru did not delay, imitating Rudra's approach, and began to draw the power of faith of all living beings in the territory. The bond of faith spread quietly from the void, connecting to the entire Jura Great Forest, and then extending to the entire territory of Jistav that had already surrendered and was under control. The hearts and minds of all the people in the two territories were moved by an invisible force, and their simple trust and longing turned into a torrent of faith, gathering towards Rimuru from all directions. The combined population of the two territories was nearly 100 million. Compared with the 800 million people Rudra once possessed, the faith base was vastly different, but now, this volume was more than enough. After a massive amount of faith poured into its own authority system, Rimuru focused its energy and suddenly released the move Absolute Severance. The peerless cutting power was formed with the blessing of heavy faith. Before the slash arrived, Michael, who was inside the fortress, felt his hair stand on end, and an extreme sense of crisis rose in his heart. He did not dare to be negligent in the slightest. While maintaining the castle guard, he hurriedly laid out several layers of overlapping high-level defensive enchantments one after another. The layers of barriers were interlocked, trying to unload the force layer by layer and block this slash. However, absolute severance, which was sublimated by the faith of hundreds of millions of living beings, easily shattered the layers of defensive enchantments. Under Michael's horrified and unbelievable gaze, the castle guard barrier, which he had always regarded as an invincible iron wall, and was recognized as impossible to be broken by external forces, cracked in response, and the entire closed space built by authority collapsed suddenly. The absolute defense he relied on for safety completely disintegrated. Michael had no time to indulge in shock, quickly gripped his sword, and used his remaining power to block horizontally. The castle guard had consumed most of the power of the slash before it collapsed. The remaining slash was carried by him with difficulty, the sword body trembled endlessly, and Michael was also shaken back repeatedly. But just as he barely stabilized his figure, and his mind was still lingering on the shock of the defense being broken, Rimuru used the space jump authority of Scorching King Thugga to break the spatial barrier instantly and appeared abruptly within reach of Michael. The power originating from the Scorched Dragon surged and rose on the weapon Rimuru held. Crimson flames spread wildly along the blade, high temperature distorted the surrounding air, and the dragon flame pressure like burning the sky locked Michael's every evasion direction. Rimuru looked cold, raised its hand, held the sword, and charged up the offensive, speaking loudly, "Now that you don't have the castle guard to rely on, I want to see what else you can use to block this blow." Scorching Dragon's burning severance. The violent and scorching blade light wrapped in dragon flames slashed down suddenly. Michael, who had lost the protection of absolute defense, faced the fatal blow originating from the Scorched Dragon's authority. Problematic ad. Reported here. You can disable pop-up ads by becoming a contributor. Become a contributor. #93 Chapter 93 The Insect Emperor and the Insect Demon. Chapter 93 The Insect Emperor and the Insector. Just as Rimuru and Seal were simultaneously confronting Rudra and Michael, the Insector Razzle, who had been moved by Grubel many years ago, broke into the labyrinth fortress. A tyrannical magic power erupted with a boom, surging recklessly through the layers of the labyrinth's passages. Countless monsters sensed Razzle's presence and surged toward him. Facing the overwhelming onslaught, Razzle showed no intention of retreating. He charged forward, clashing head-on all the way, using his own raw combat power to force his way through the tide of monsters. He had only one purpose in coming here: to kill the storm dragon, Veldora Tempest. In the public perception of the entire otherworld, the storm dragon Veldora Tempest was the Jura Tempest Federation's most deterrent and top-tier core combat force, the absolute trump card that sustained the deterrence of the entire nation. As long as he successfully slew Veldora, the Jura Tempest Federation's combat system and external deterrence would suffer a fatal blow, drastically reducing the pressure on Grubel, sharing his burden to the greatest extent while he was mired in the war, and breaking the deadlock. Holding on to this conviction, Razzle feared none of the labyrinth's many dangers. He charged forward in a bloodbath, forcing his way through all obstacles, advancing step by step toward the deeper core areas. With the bloody wind of residual magic power still lingering around him, Razzle had just defeated the monsters on the 8th floor. Taking a step forward, he broke straight into the 9th floor of the labyrinth. Unlike the previous floors, the atmosphere of the labyrinth's 9th floor was suddenly silent and frigid. A thin, deep purple magical mist drifted through the dark passages. In the dead silent space, even the airflow was barely audible, with only layers of oppressive pressure heavily shrouding the surroundings. Just as he steadied his stance, preparing to erupt his magic power once more and force his way through the obstacles ahead, a clear and familiar aura abruptly pierced through the layers of mist, settling firmly into his perception. This aura was both strange and familiar, carrying the unique magical fluctuations characteristic of the Insector race, bearing the traits of his own kind imprinted deep within his bloodline. Razzle's advancing steps suddenly halted. The murderous edge in his eyes softened slightly, and a hint of surprise and amusement flickered across his brow. He focused his mind to sense it carefully and confirmed without a doubt that this was indeed a genuine Insector aura. "Is that another Insector?" Mumbling in his heart, a trace of astonishment rippled through his mind. He had thought he was the only one who would betray Zelanis. But the aura of his kin coming from the 9th floor at this moment was incredibly clear. It was by no means a common clansman who had wandered in by mistake, rather, it carried a tense battle intent and a sense of detachment from the race. Interesting. A faint curve played on the corner of Razel's lips as comprehension dawned on him. It seems I am not the only one who betrayed Zelanis. It turned out that the high and mighty Zelanis could not firmly bind the loyalty of all Insectars. There was still someone like him who had broken free from the shackles of their race and deviated from their original destiny. At this thought, the absolute, solitary determination in his heart softened slightly. He had been fighting alone, forcing his way through the labyrinth's layers of obstacles just to slay the storm dragon and ease Grubel's burden. But the appearance of his kin's aura now gave him a new idea. Now, with a formidable enemy ahead, and the battle in chaos, if he could win over this fellow clansman, who had also turned away from Zelanis, and persuade them to defect and fight alongside him, it would undoubtedly be a massive help. Whether they broke through the remaining areas of the labyrinth together or joined forces against the storm dragon, it would drastically reduce the pressure, allowing him to accomplish his goal more smoothly. Thinking this way, Razel suppressed the biting killing intent around him. No longer in a hurry to force his way forward, he changed direction and, with steady steps, began to slowly approach the source of his kin's aura. Within the dark, deep ninth floor of the labyrinth, two Insectars who had turned away from their former master were quietly drawing closer to each other. The control room clearly projected the movements of every floor of the labyrinth onto screens, leaving no disturbance hidden. This was the central core of the entire labyrinth, fully controlled by Ramiris, who monitored every movement within it at all times. The moment Razel set foot in the labyrinth's domain and formally broke into the fortress, that unique magic fluctuation belonging to the Insector race was immediately and precisely captured by the domain-wide array, clearly appearing on the screen. Ramiris's tiny body floated in front of the screen. Her large, round eyes suddenly widened, her face a picture of shock and astonishment, and she couldn't help but let out a cry of surprise. "Wait, what the heck is that?" She leaned closer to the screen, carefully studying the unfamiliar figure in the footage who was advancing steadily, enveloped in a fierce battle intent. Her brow furrowed tightly, her voice filled with disbelief. An Insector? Why would one of those things suddenly show up here? Just as Ramiris was filled with doubt and apprehension, staring intently at the intruder on the light screen, a steady, upright figure stepped forward slowly from behind. It was Zijin. He was all too familiar with the unique magical aura of his own kind. Sensing that familiar bloodline fluctuation on the screen, his aura instantly grew heavy and condensed, a restrained yet extremely sharp battle intent quietly swirling around him. He took a step forward, bowed, and spoke in a solemn and firm tone, carrying a hint of stubborn pride unique to a duel between kin. "Lady Ramiris, as for this fellow, please allow me to handle him." He raised his eyes to look at the floating magical screen, his gaze locked onto his kin who had broken into the labyrinth. A complex mix of emotions and an intense competitive spirit surged in the depths of his eyes. "I, too, am an Insector. Today is the perfect opportunity to see for myself whether the power that old geezer Zelanis bestowed upon our kind is even worthy of being compared to the power Lord Rimuru has granted me." Seeing this, Ramiris, who was standing beside him, slightly raised her small face, about to speak up in objection. She had wanted to advise Zijin to act with caution, urging him to take a more stable and safe approach rather than rushing in blindly. But before she could utter a word, the moment she turned her head, she locked eyes directly with Zijin's incredibly resolute, open, and stubborn gaze. That gaze was steady and burning, filled with unwavering determination, and a firm obsession to prove himself in a head-on duel with his kin, leaving absolutely no room for compromise. Seeing Zijin like this, the soft-hearted Ramiris instantly lost all her resistance. The words of dissuasion that had reached her lips were swallowed right back down, and her momentum softened instantly. She put her small hands on her hips, sighed helplessly, and waved her hand in compromise. "Fine, fine." She knew Zijin's personality well. Once he made up his mind about something, he would never easily change it. "Anyway, the labyrinth is my domain. Here, you are guaranteed immortality, and will never truly die. Mentioning the rules of the labyrinth she controlled, Ramiris spoke with absolute confidence. Then, she gave him a serious warning, her tone filled with high expectations and instructions, but you remember this, you must win, and you must win beautifully. Show this uninvited insector exactly what we're made of. As you command. The moment he received Ramiris's permission and command, the battle intent in Zijin's eyes erupted completely. Before his voice had even faded, without making the slightest extra sound, he instantly vanished from the control room. Traversing through space in a flash, he headed straight into the labyrinth to face this sudden intruder of his own kind, Razel. Just as Razel was advancing steadily by following his kin's aura, mentally planning how to win them over, a faint ripple of spatial distortion suddenly shimmered in the air before him. With no booming sound or magical warning, a tall, cold black figure emerged out of thin air, standing firmly right in the middle of Razel's path, completely blocking his way. It was Zijin. The moment their eyes met, two insector auras of the same origin, but vastly different temperaments clashed violently in the air. Sensing the intensely familiar aura in the other's bloodline, Razel's long-tensed mind suddenly relaxed. The fierce, murderous glint in his eyes quietly faded, replaced by an irrepressible sigh of emotion and deep sentiment. Since turning away from Zelani's and embarking on his own path, he had experienced countless conflicts, yet he had never again met a fellow clansman who had broken free from their old master's shackles and abandoned their race's destiny. Now, within this perilous labyrinth, seeing one of his own kind again after so many years, a wave of complex emotions surged in his chest, causing the battle-hardened Razel's mind to churn with a sense of transience, as if everything had changed. But this sentiment lasted for only a brief moment. AI Model, Gemini 3. One flash light. The rationality of one determined to fight through the labyrinth quickly suppressed the emotion in his heart. Razel gathered his stray thoughts, his expression returning to indifference, and broke the silence first, his tone carrying a sense of composed arrogance. He gazed calmly at his kin before him, who stood tall with a steady aura, and frankly introduced himself. I am Razel of the Insector. Considering that we share the same bloodline, and have both forsaken Zelani's, I will give you one chance. Surrender to me now, lend me your strength, and I can accept you. These straightforward and candid words caused Zijin, with his cold expression and intense fighting spirit, to suddenly freeze. He had already assumed that the kin, who had broken into the labyrinth, was a pursuer or spy under Zelani's. His heart was filled with defensive caution and the obsession to duel. He never expected that this insector who had brazenly invaded the labyrinth had actually long since betrayed Zelani's. A flash of astonishment crossed his eyes, only to be covered by a deeper chill and determination. After a brief moment of being stunned, Zijin composed his thoughts, his eyes becoming increasingly solemn, and he spoke in a deep voice, every word ringing with strength. Razel, is it? Very well, I have noted your name. He stood as straight as a spear, surrounded by a pure aura of loyalty to his own heart, every word dripping with absolute devotion and steadfastness. Listen well. I am the most loyal and proud servant of Lord Rimuru, the guardian who watches over this endless labyrinth. Zijin. As his voice fell, the magic power around him stirred slightly, and he had already entered a state of combat readiness. You have trespassed into the labyrinth fortress of the Jura Tempest Federation without permission, wantonly invading our territory. To me, this act is a blatant provocation, and I have every reason to suppress you as an enemy. Watching Zijin's stubborn, resolute stance in defending his camp, Razel shook his head helplessly, spread his hands casually, and let out a sigh filled with a mix of regret and mockery. So that's how it is. It seems you are no different from those brothers and sisters back then who were manipulated like pawns by Zelani's, yet still foolishly and wholeheartedly followed him. He had assumed that, as fellow kin who had abandoned their old masters, they should sympathize with each other and see through the shackles of fate. He had not expected the other to remain so entrenched, becoming nothing more than a fighting force under someone else. Just as he was lamenting this, a familiar bloodline aura overlapped in his mind, and long-sealed memories surged forth. Razel narrowed his eyes slightly, observing Zijin from head to toe, his tone suddenly carrying a hint of realization and mockery. I remember who you are. The sealed past broke through the fog, and scenes from the old days became vivid. So it was you, little one. I remember that little insect clearly, the one discarded casually by that fool Zez. Back then, you couldn't even open your eyes, you were so frail that a gust of wind could have blown you away. His tone carried the vicissitudes of time, and the teasing of an elder brother. Looking at Zijin, who had grown into a tall, formidable warrior with a powerful aura, a flash of surprise crossed his eyes. My, how time flies. I never expected that such a weak little thing back then would grow up to be this big. Your physique and aura are almost about to surpass me, your older brother. The teasing faded, his voice took a sudden turn, and his tone became completely cold. A biting murderous intent burst forth, replacing all mockery and lamentation. Since that is the case, I shall show you the highest respect an elder brother can give his younger brother. Razel's magic power suddenly surged, and the air currents in the labyrinth churned violently. His gaze was sharp, locked firmly onto Zijin before him, every word as heavy as a thunderclap. I will give it my all and completely crush you as you are now. Facing Razel's declaration, filled with provocation and the mocking intent to crush him, Zijin remained calm from beginning to end, his eyes devoid of any anger or ripples. The mockery of his kin, the teasing about the past, and even the harsh words threatening to crush him failed to shake his mind in the slightest. The composure forged through tempering, deeply rooted in his heart, and his absolute confidence in his own power meant he did not need to rely on rage to build momentum. Zijin simply raised his arm and threw a punch. The movement was understated, as casual as brushing off a speck of dust. There was no flashy explosion of magic, no fancy setup of techniques, it was merely the purest, most simple physical strike. Yet, this plain and unadorned punch, the moment it broke through the air, suddenly whipped up a heavy wind pressure, and an overwhelmingly domineering force came crashing out. Razel, who had been relaxed and mocking just a moment ago, saw his expression change drastically. A sense of extreme crisis rose in his heart. He had never expected that the once frail young insector could deliver such a terrifying force. Not daring to be the least bit careless, Razel instantly cast aside all distracting thoughts, his spirit tightened to the limit. He poured the strength of his entire body and magic power into his arm, unleashing a full-force punch to meet this seemingly casual attack head-on. A dull, heavy sound of bodies colliding exploded in the gloomy ninth floor, shaking the surrounding floating violet magic mist until it dispersed completely. The hard rock of the labyrinth floor cracked in response, forming fine spiderweb patterns. The two forces of pure physical power clashed violently. The strong recoil made Razel's arm go numb, and his body could not help but retreat half a step. His expression darkened, and the mockery in his eyes vanished completely, replaced by gravity and surprise. He remarked in a low voice, "Fine. It seems I underestimated you. It's been a long time, and it looks like you've grown in more ways than just size." At this moment, he completely discarded the inherent prejudice that the opponent is just that abandoned larva from back then, and truly regarded the kin before him as a worthy opponent. But Zijin remained silent, completely ignoring his words. The insector race is naturally covered in an exoskeleton with extremely strong resistance to various elemental magic and law-based arts, making magic attacks ineffective in battles between kin. Therefore, Zijin chose to engage Razel in close-quarters combat. Without needing extra probing or magical reinforcement, Zijin's figure suddenly dashed forward, his body like a blade suddenly drawn from its sheath, actively closing in on Razel. Fist winds whistled, elbow strikes crisscrossed, and knee strikes were fierce. Both were insector warriors proficient in physical combat. Their moves were fierce and ruthless, each strike aiming straight for vital points, with attack and defense switching faster than the eye could follow. Their hard exoskeletons constantly collided and scraped, emitting harsh metallic clangs, each impact carrying a terrifying power capable of rending mountains. Within the narrow space of the labyrinth, the flames of war were fully ignited, and a sharp wind pressure swept across the entire floor. Yet, as the slaughter continued, the shock in Razel's heart grew deeper and deeper. He prided himself on being battle-hardened with a formidable body, counting as a top-tier combatant among his kin. Yet, before Zijin's airtight, fierce, and domineering offensive, he was gradually falling behind. Zijin's offense and defense had no flaws, his speed, strength, and explosive power were all a cut above his own, and the rhythm of the close-quarters struggle was completely controlled. The sharp offensive advanced in layers, continuous and unending, forcing Razel to retreat step by step. His arms were sore and numb, his breathing chaotic, and every block was incredibly strenuous. He was firmly suppressed the entire time, with absolutely no room to counterattack. Under the storm-like close-quarters offensive, Razel dodged in a sorry state and defended with difficulty. The contempt in his heart was completely gone, replaced by a bone-chilling realization and shock. Only now did he truly understand why Zez had been so ruthless as to discard an unhatched, seemingly harmless larva back then. It was not at all because the larva was weak and useless. On the contrary, it was because Zijin's talent was too terrifying, too heaven-defying. Even in the larval stage, while still in its swaddling clothes and unable to open its eyes, it harbored terrifying talent and infinite potential capable of shaking an insector general. Zez, feeling threatened, had seen this early on, knowing that in time, this larva would surely surpass him and completely threaten his position in Zelani's heart. In order to eliminate future trouble and solidify his own position, Zez had spared nothing to heartlessly abandon this kin with peerless talent. Realizing this long-sealed, secret reason, Razel's mind was shaken. Looking at Zijin, whose offensive was becoming increasingly sharp and unfathomable, nothing but endless horror remained in his heart. Chapter 94, The Death of Razel, Lord of Hope, Reward Pool Still Stacking. The fierce close-quarters struggle continued to roar with the constant collision of two hardened insectoid carapaces. On the pitch-black battlefield, the life-and-death struggle between the two insectars had already clearly determined the superior. Razel's thick exoskeleton, originally the insector's prideful natural barrier, was being crushed inch by inch under Zijin's storm-like close-range assault. Every strike and every thrust from Zijin was precise, fierce, and powerful. The crisp sound of carapace colliding with carapace echoed incessantly, accompanied by the dense sound of cracking armor exploding in the air. Deep black cracks rapidly crawled all over Razel's dorsal, thoracic, and limb armor. The hard cuticle cracked and peeled in large swathes, then shattered and fell off in chunks, with fine armor debris and insector bodily fluid splattering all over the ground. Meanwhile, under Zijin's relentless heavy blows, the muscle fibers inside Razel, originally tightly bound and connecting his entire body, had been torn, severed, and unbundled over a large area. Countless muscle filaments were completely deactivated, and the power source of his heavy armored body was nearly paralyzed. Every slight movement triggered tearing pain throughout his insectoid body. After hard-tanking several destructive collisions, Razel's overloaded insectoid body had finally reached its limit. His heavy insectoid limbs went soft, no longer able to support the weight of his thick carapace. His tall insectoid body swayed violently, then crashed heavily to his knees, and finally collapsed onto the ground. His shattered exoskeleton made a dull, heavy sound as it struck the ground, and he could no longer muster a shred of combat power. Razel, covered in broken armor and torn muscles, lay among the fragments. His insectoid body twitched slightly, and his originally sharp appendages hung down powerlessly. A sense of immense humiliation, helplessness, and guilt instantly engulfed him. He spoke with difficulty in a low, hoarse voice, filled with despondency. "I'm sorry, Gribel. I can't help you anymore." He had burned through all the power in his body, yet he had been completely crushed by his fellow insector, Zijin, unable to even pin him down. A moment later, Razel raised his broken insectoid head and quietly watched the figure approaching steadily in front of him. Zijin, also covered in a complete, hard exoskeleton, walked over. His armor was clean and intact, with only a few sparse, shallow scratches, forming an extremely glaring contrast to his own body, which was covered in shattered and festering wounds. Knowing he was thoroughly defeated and had no strength left to fight, Razel felt a sense of dead, relieved calm at the bottom of his heart. He calmly awaited the final disposal of his kin, saying slowly, "Come on, eat me. Just like Zelani's eats the offspring that don't meet his expectations." As an offspring under Zelani's, He had long known the cold rules: those who were not strong enough and could not meet the standards would eventually be eliminated and devoured. Having been defeated, he was no longer worthy of existence. However, Zijin, who was approaching step by step, stopped in front of him. His insectoid head, covered by a hard faceplate, shook slightly, and a cold yet firm voice rang out, "I will not eat you." He looked down at the broken insectoid body, his tone without a ripple, yet carrying extreme piety and self-restraint. "Although you and I are both insectars, all your power stems entirely from the bestowal of Zelanis. I do not covet this power derived from him, and I absolutely do not allow, nor do I want, his aura to defile the power Rimuru-sama has bestowed upon me." Zijin raised his hand to gently brush over his hard exoskeleton faceplate. It was an insectoid body reshaped and purified by new power, pure and powerful, having long broken free from the shackles of his former master. "The power Rimuru-sama bestowed upon me has long reshaped my insectoid body and sublimated my soul. It is powerful and pure, supreme and flawless. This power of yours, which clings to Zelanis, is inferior and turbid. If I were to devour you, I would gain no amplification. In the end, it would only pointlessly defile this gift exclusive to me. It would be useless, except to blaspheme the gift of Rimuru-sama." After hearing Zijin's words, Razel said in disbelief, "The power bestowed upon you by Demon Lord Rimuru." This sentence was like a thunderclap, shattering the remaining luck and obsession in his heart. After a moment of dead silence, low and bitter laughter erupted from his throat, growing more hysterical, filled with bone-deep self-mockery and absurdity. The laughter was hoarse and dry, mixed with the resonance unique to insects, echoing over the empty battlefield, every word a display of self-inflicted humiliation. "Ha ha ha. So that's it, so that's really how it is. Then I really was too stupid." He gripped his broken, spasming insectoid limbs tightly. All his confidence and all his carefully planned chances of victory collapsed at this moment, turning into bubbles. "I actually naively thought that as long as I killed Storm Dragon Veldora, I could turn this battle around and reverse all the disadvantages. In the end, it was nothing but ridiculous wishful thinking." He had exhausted all his combat power, and his only bet to turn the battle around was placed entirely on slaying Storm Dragon Veldora. He was certain that as long as he removed this top-tier powerhouse, he could shake the foundation of Rimuru's side and win a glimmer of survival for Grubel. But only after being thoroughly defeated did he suddenly realize that his vision and strength had been pitifully small from the very beginning. Just as Razel was immersed in endless self-mockery and despair, a cold, indifferent insectoid voice rang out suddenly, directly and roughly interrupting his monologue. "You cannot kill Veldora-sama." A short sentence without ripples, yet carrying an unquestionable, absolute certainty, instantly suppressed all of Razel's laughter. Razel froze, his trembling compound eyes staring fixedly at Zijin. His broken insectoid body subconsciously tightened. His remaining sanity was completely stirred by this sentence, and his heart was filled with extreme astonishment. Zijin stood steadily, his insectoid body covered in hard exoskeleton standing tall like a spear. There was no contempt in his eyes, only the coldness and piety of stating a fact. He continued to speak slowly, every word clear, and with the weight of 1,000 jin. "I said you cannot kill Veldora-sama. This power of mine that crushes you was bestowed and purified by Rimuru-sama himself. This close-quarters martial art and combat technique of mine that crushes you was personally taught and polished by Veldora-sama. In other words, all the combat power I possess now stems entirely from the gifts of the two Sama. In terms of power foundation and combat realm, whether it is martial arts or power, Veldora-sama is far above me." He looked down at his thoroughly defeated kin, his tone becoming increasingly flat, yet every word pierced the heart, completely shattering Razel's last delusion. "I, who you exhausted your life's learning and burned all your power to fight against, yet could not shake in the slightest and even completely lost to, am merely a junior who inherited the fur of the Two-Sama's power and skills. If you cannot even defeat me, with our differences in strength, vision, and level being worlds apart, how could you have the confidence to attempt to slay Storm Dragon Veldora-sama, who stands at the pinnacle of the firmament? This straightforward analysis completely pierced through all of Razel's arrogance and luck. For a long time, dead silence enveloped him. Razel froze in place, the light in his compound eyes fading away bit by bit, leaving only endless desolation and bone-deep self-mockery. He slowly lowered his high-held insectoid head, his broken body completely relaxing. All unwillingness and obsession dissipated, leaving only complete helplessness and absurdity. He whispered and muttered repeatedly, his tone bitter to the extreme, filled with the despondency of sudden realization, so that's it. So that's it. I was truly too arrogant. Just because I surpassed the ordinary demon lord level in this world, I blindly inflated, truly thinking I had the capital to contend with true dragons and slay a storm dragon. Zijin looked at his kin beneath him, who had completely lost all threat, and was left with only a broken insectoid body, and no longer had the mind for further elaboration. He silently restrained the indifference in his eyes, his right arm covered in hard insectoid armor slowly gathering power, without any mercy or hesitation. The next moment, Zijin punched out fiercely. A dull and domineering sound of breaking air exploded. The heavy fist, concentrating all his power, accurately and precisely smashed down, imprinted firmly on the center of Razel's broken chest. Accompanied by the harsh sound of carapace cracking, the already riddled chest armor instantly shattered completely, and fine horny armor debris splattered everywhere. The incomparably tyrannical power penetrated the layers of damaged insectoid body, directly crushing and striking the magic core. A subtle yet fatal cracking sound exploded inside his body. As the magic core that supported all of Razel's power and maintained his life, it instantly cracked and shattered under this absolutely overwhelming assault. In an instant, Razel's tense insectoid body went completely limp, his trembling compound eyes rapidly dimming, and the torn muscle fibers throughout his body completely lost their activity. The severe pain came swiftly and thoroughly, yet in an instant, it turned into nothingness. His vital signs faded away like a receding tide. The battle that belonged to him, his struggle, his obsession, were completely ended at this moment. At the moment when his life burned to its last remaining candle, in his blurred consciousness on the verge of death, there was no resentful hatred in Razel's heart, no hysterical madness of defeat, only a trace of gentle and sour yearning. He actually still had many things he wanted to say, many expectations he had not yet realized. He had imagined countless times that when this chaotic war finally subsided, when all disputes settled, he would take off the fatigue and heaviness of his battles and properly accompany Grubel. No fighting, no risking his life, no carrying the burden of victory or mission, just simply chatting side by side, recounting the past. They could talk about the trivial details of the long war, talk about the stable life ahead, talk about where they should go, and what they should do after the storm cleared, seeking a peace that did not require fighting, spending a period of plain and free time. That was his only thought and comfort in the desperate war, the small expectation he tried his best to protect. It is a pity that the world is impermanent, and the loser has no return. This simple and gentle wish was eventually buried in the cold battlefield along with his broken magic core and dissipating origin. He would never have a chance again. The dim compound eyes completely lost all luster, and the broken insectoid body completely fell silent. Razel died completely on this messy land. On the other side, Grubel stood beside Rudra, fully guarding against Rimuru before him, every inch of space filled with a murderous aura titan to the extreme. But at this very moment, a sense of dead silence, the sudden rupture and complete dissipation of a soul connection pierced through all his defenses without warning. It was the true extinction originating from a soul bond, clear, cold, and absolutely real, without the slightest ambiguity or illusion. Grubel's body suddenly stiffened, the stable holy light aura around him instantly disordered violently, and his steady breathing suddenly stopped. His eyes, which had always been calm and firm, surged with extreme shock and disbelief for the first time. No need to investigate, no need to confirm, he perceived with absolute clarity Razel had fallen. The best friend who had fought side by side with him through countless wars, shared life and death hardships, and carried the expectations of each other after the war, had completely dissipated from the world. A violent tremor of the soul swept through his whole body, shattering all his calmness and composure. Grubel turned his head violently, his gaze piercing through the distant spatial barrier, staring fixedly at the direction of dead silence deep within the labyrinth. Where there used to echo the fighting spirit of fighting side by side, now he could no longer feel even a trace of his best friend's existence. Monstrous grief, the sudden loss, mixed with bone-deep anger, instantly swept through his limbs and bones. In just an instant, he suddenly retracted his gaze, turned his head sharply, and the scarlet in his eyes faded all gentleness, leaving only the biting murderous intent and monstrous rage that burned everything, glaring fixedly at Rimuru directly in front. The majestic spiritual power belonging to the hero rose uncontrollably and crazily, shaking the spatial barrier of the entire battlefield. Just at the moment when Grubel's emotions reached their limit, and his soul's will completed its ultimate metamorphosis, an ethereal, solemn, and emotionless voice of the world suddenly rang directly in the depths of his mind. Conditions for evolution met. Individual name, Grubel. Unique skill Berserker has successfully evolved into Ultimate Skill Lord of Hope. Problematic ad. Reported here. You can disable pop-up ads by becoming a contributor. Become a contributor #95 Chapter 95 Rudra, you, Erdogan. Chapter 95, Rudra, are you deaf? Rimuru gathered the power of faith from the entire Jura Great Forest and Jistav around him, shattering Michael's castle guard with absolute severance. Rudra took all of this in, his expression turning extremely unsightly. At this moment Grubel, who had sensed the death of his close friend Razzle and obtained the ultimate skill King of Hope, saw scenes of countless fallen living beings, ruined kingdoms, and dissipated souls flash through his mind. The long-accumulated despair and resentment completely shattered the shackles of his reason, and he could no longer maintain any semblance of calm. You executioner! A hoarse, violent, and infinitely tragic roar exploded between heaven and earth, the sound vibrating through every inch of air, filled with accusations against the endless slaughter. Grubel's eyes were blood-red, and the unique aura of the King of Hope surged around him. The brilliant golden-white halo fluctuated violently, devoid of any gentle salvation, leaving only the resolve to destroy everything. Just how many more lives do you have to take? How much more hope do you have to ruin before you will stop? Before his roars could fade, Grubel threw all caution to the wind, pouring all of his magicules and power into a desperate, frenzied assault against Rimuru. He raised his hand and clenched it in midair, and an invisible, colorless binding force instantly locked down the entire space. Infinite prison formed in an instant, with layers of spatial barriers, causal shackles, and soul binds weaving into an airtight, absolute cage, firmly trapping Rimuru's figure within. Having sealed his target, Grubel did not pause for even a fraction of a second, unleashing absolute severance with all his might. This strike tore through the air and severed causality, carrying a domineering force capable of breaking through any defense. It blasted straight toward Rimuru inside the cage with a crystal-clear objective, to forcefully break through the absolute defense Rimuru relied on for protection, heavily wounding this ruler of monsters who had ended countless conflicts but also ruined countless lives. Yet reality, after all, did not bend to his wishes. The killer move he had deployed with all his might appeared incredibly pale, and laughable in the face of an absolute difference in strength. Firmly trapped within the infinite prison, Rimuru's expression remained calm and serene from beginning to end, his eyes completely undisturbed, showing not a hint of the embarrassment of being bound. Facing this cage of reincarnation capable of imprisoning even gods, he merely raised his palm casually and lightly touched the spatial barrier surrounding him with his fingertip. There was no earth-shattering collision, only a faint, soft sound of space cracking could be heard. The infinite prison constructed by the King of Hope, which was said to never fall, shattered inch by inch like fragile glass and vanished into thin air. All the binding forces were instantly dissolved, clean and effortless. The moment the seal was broken, Grubel's absolute severance tore through the air, its pure white blade light pressing right in front of Rimuru. Everyone assumed Rimuru would use absolute defense to take this strike. But to everyone's surprise, Rimuru did not activate any defensive moves. His eyes narrowed slightly as magicules flowed around his body. With a wave of his hand, an identical absolute severance materialized in midair, charging head-on against Grubel's attack. The violent shockwave of energy instantly swept across the fields, tearing through clouds and shaking the earth, while the surrounding space constantly warped and cracked. The two forces clashed for a mere instant before the victor was immediately decided. With a sharp, air-rending explosion, Grubel's slash shattered on impact, completely overwhelmed, swallowed, and crushed by Rimuru's attack. The sweeping pure white blade light of the residual force forced Grubel to hastily defend. Gritting his teeth, he suppressed his shock and embarrassment, tightly gripping truth with both hands. Pouring all his remaining power, he swung horizontally with all his might, using the power of the divine weapon to forcefully cleave through the oncoming residual absolute slash. Instantly, a majestic spiritual pressure gathered around his body as he charged up for his ultimate killer move, Truth Spirit Domination slash. The brilliant, sharp blade aura had already formed on the edge of the blade, its majestic momentum rising steadily, only a final moment away from exploding. But on the battlefield, there was never any room for hesitation. Before Grubel could fully charge his technique, and before the Truth Spirit Domination slash could unleash even a fraction of its power, Rimuru's figure had already crossed the endless distance, closing in instantly. Without any fancy abilities or flashy moves, a simple, clean punch carrying a terrifying, world-destroying force slammed precisely and ruthlessly onto Grubel's chest. This scene was fully witnessed by Kondo and Damrata, who were standing nearby. If they hesitated any longer, they would only watch their companion fall, and the situation would have no chance of turning around. The moment they locked eyes, Kondo and Damrata made their decision, refusing to stand idly by any longer. Both of them burst forward at the same time, carrying an unstoppable momentum of absolute resolve. They leaped onto the battlefield together, intending to exert all their combat power to relieve the pressure on the heavily wounded Grubel, provide support, and desperately stop the seemingly invincible ruler of monsters. As a peak human swordsman, Kondo suddenly released all of his cold, sharp sword pressure. His right hand firmly gripped the hilt of the sword at his waist. A clanging metallic ring pierced the sky as a cold, sharp light suddenly burst forth. A sharp, exquisite Japanese katana was drawn, its chilly blade light reflecting across the entire battlefield. Condensing his lifetime of swordsmanship cultivation and pouring all of his magicules, Kondo pushed his swordsmanship foundation to its absolute limit, his sharp, overbearing sword intent sweeping in all directions. "Take this!" A low shout echoed across the battlefield. He moved instantly, his figure rushing forward like an afterimage. In a split second, he unleashed 5 consecutive strikes. 5 crisscrossing, sharp sword energies with tricky and fierce trajectories arrived in rapid succession. This was his trump card and strongest killer move, Plum Blossom, 5-flower thrust. Facing this swift and fierce 5-fold sword technique, Rimuru's clear pupils flickered slightly, a trace of understanding flashing in his eyes. With just an instant of analysis, he completely saw through the core essence of this sword style. The logic of power generation, the movement trajectory, and the foundation of the sword intent were exactly the same as the Oboro-Ryu swordsmanship taught to him by Hakuru. There were only slight differences in the form of the moves and the details of power delivery. Though different branches of the same style and different forms from the same source, both originated from the Oboro-Ryu swordsmanship system, only differing in their paths of cultivation and direction of evolution. Just as Rimuru was secretly pondering, Seal's cool and confident voice suddenly echoed clearly in his mind. "Master, let me handle this move. I will show this foolish human firsthand what true Oboro-Ryu swordsmanship is." Seal's tone carried absolute composure and overwhelming confidence. Without a hint of contempt, it possessed an absolute confidence that looked down on the entire situation. Rimuru did not hesitate in the slightest. His mind relaxed instantly as he completely relinquished control of his body, handing it over to Seal without reservation. In an instant, the aura around Rimuru changed dramatically. His posture remained unchanged, but the katana in his hand was quietly raised, its blade light gathering and charging. This was the true strongest secret art of the Oboro-Ryu, which Hakuru had spent his entire life learning, and had fully passed down in another timeline. 8-fold cherry blossom, 8-flower flash. The sky filled with brilliant blade light as 8 cold slashes, like layers of 8-fold cherry blossom petals, tore through the air, and crashed head-on against Kondo's 5 sword energies. A rapid succession of intense metallic clashes exploded continuously, and the deafening shockwaves swept wildly in all directions. With his lifetime of exquisite swordsmanship foundation, Kondo's plum blossom, 5-flower thrust blocked layer by layer, firmly catching the first 5 slashes unleashed by Seal. The sword forces clashed in equal measure, with each collision bursting into blinding sparks and violent shockwaves. But unfortunately, the killer sword technique Kondo took pride in had only 5 attacks. Whereas the Obora Ryu's secret art unleashed by Seal consisted of a full 8 slashes. With his 5 blocks barely exhausted, the remaining 3 highly condensed slashes pierced through the shattered residual sword energy without any hindrance, hacking down ruthlessly with cold, sharp killing intent. The crisp yet cruel sound of tearing flesh rang out in succession. Kondo had absolutely no time to react. Dodging, blocking, parrying, all actions were already too late. The 3 deadly slashes landed precisely. The first sharp slash directly severed his entire left arm, causing blood to spray out. The remaining 2 followed immediately, ruthlessly slicing through his legs. Intense pain swept through his entire body, blood gushing wildly from the severed limbs, and his strength drained away along with the flowing blood. He stared with wide, trembling eyes, his pupils filled with absolute disbelief and extreme shock, staring blankly at Seal, who stood there with a cold demeanor, holding a katana. As a swordsman who had spent his entire life studying the way of the sword, and had trained Obora Ryu swordsmanship to the peak of humanity, Kondo had always firmly believed that his plum blossom, 5-flower thrust was the pinnacle of swordsmanship in the world. He had spent his life dominating the battlefield, invincible with this sword style, never meeting an opponent of the same caliber, and never imagining that there could exist someone whose mastery of Obora Ryu swordsmanship surpassed his own. What was even more absurd and harder for him to accept was that the one who crushed him, mastered the Obora Ryu, and possessed a swordsmanship attainment several times greater than his was not a human master swordsman, or a grandmaster of the sword, but a monster, a being whose attributes were naturally supposed to be countered by the Obora Ryu swordsmanship. The massive sense of subversion, the despair of a collapsed faith, and the humiliation of defeat crushed Kondo's spirit layer by layer. His lifelong obsession with the sword, along with all his pride and confidence, shattered into dust at this moment. But this daze and shock lasted for only a fleeting moment. Faced with life and death, the dignity of defeat was already insignificant. His remaining survival instinct and the ruthlessness of a desperate counterattack instantly dispersed all his shock. A flash of crazed resolve suddenly crossed Kondo's eyes. He no longer clung to the so-called duel of swordsmen or martial dignity. Covered in blood, he suddenly let go of the Japanese sword in his hand, which had already lost its meaning. Clang! The crisp sound of metal hitting the ground rang out. The katana that had accompanied him for half his life rolled into the dust, completely declaring the curtain call of his path of the sword. Immediately after, squeezing out his last remaining ounce of strength, he reached toward his waist with trembling but swift movements, pulling out a pistol. He wanted to activate King of Condemnation to enhance his bullets and fire them. The decency of a swordsman and the honor of a warrior were completely thrown to the back of his mind in the face of a desperate life-and-death situation. But Seal's movements were far faster and more decisive than his. A single strike of swallow reversal flashed through Kondo's body in an instant. In the next second, time seemed to freeze briefly. Kondo maintained his posture of raising the gun to shoot, but his body was cleanly and sharply split in 2 right down the middle. The left and right halves of his body, accompanied by a spray of blood, slowly parted to both sides, and crashed heavily into the pool of scarlet on the ground. This top human swordsman who had once dominated the era saw his chance at a counterattack, but at the cost of his swordsmanship dignity, ultimately turned to ash as he perished completely under the Obora Ryu secret art. The battlefield suddenly fell into a brief, dead silence. Seal sheathed the sword, his cool and profound aura slowly receding, before calmly handing control of the body back to Rimuru. Regaining his dominant consciousness, Rimuru looked down at the gruesome corpse on the ground. A trace of extreme indifference and disdain rose in his clear eyes as he spoke softly, his tone carrying a faint hint of mockery and contempt. Scum with absolutely no sense of honor. In a fair and square duel between swordsmen, one should accept defeat gracefully upon losing. To actually attempt to pull a gun and launch a sneak attack is a truly despicable and cowardly act. He raised his eyes slightly, looking at the dazed Damrata in the distance, his voice flat yet every word razor-sharp. Though I was never some honorable, upright person to begin with, and after all, I am not human now and have no need to abide by your so-called human morality and dignity. But to so easily discard the martial honor that is the very foundation of your existence. Your lifelong swordsmanship is ultimately nothing but a joke. Before the dust could settle on the bloody scene of Kondo being instantly killed by Swallow Reversal, and his body splitting apart, the sole remaining reinforcement, Damrata, could no longer suppress the monstrous rage and terror in his heart. He knew very well that with Grubel heavily wounded and Kondo dead, the battle had completely collapsed. If he backed down now, all three of them would perish here today. Without the slightest hesitation, Damrata grit his teeth, pouring all of his magicules, physical strength, and authority into his fists. A brilliant, blinding milky white holy light erupted around him, and his majestic, domineering fist pressure violently crushed the surrounding air. Abandoning all defense, he channeled the strongest martial arts secret art of his life, throwing a punch with a life-risking momentum holy domination collapsing fist. A deafening roar shook heaven and earth. The fist wind, carrying the destructive power of the holy attribute, tore through the sky. With a terrifying momentum capable of shattering mountains and cracking cities, it smashed straight toward Rimuru standing in the center of the battlefield. This was Damrata's ultimate strike, exhausting all his strength in a single bid to break the deadlock and avenge his companions. Yet, facing this terrifying, sure-kill punch, Rimuru remained as indifferent as ever from beginning to end, showing not even the slightest interest in looking at it directly. His expression was cool and indifferent, his brow completely untroubled. With just a thought, a clear, transparent barrier with no flashy anomalies instantly enveloped his body, and the absolute defense constructed by his ultimate power silently took shape. The holy domination collapsing fist, capable of crushing all things, slammed heavily against the defensive barrier. The violent holy power exploded with a roar, kicking up a storm of dust and turbulence, and blinding white light instantly swallowed the entire area. However, the indestructible absolute barrier remained completely motionless, without even a single ripple appearing. Damrata's all-out ultimate strike was like a stone sinking into the ocean, completely dissolved and turned to nothingness, unable to shake Rimuru even a fraction. At the exact instant of Damrata's psychological shock, when his move had missed, his old strength was spent, and his new strength had yet to form, Rimuru moved. He gripped his katana in a reverse hold, the cold blade light condensed within the edge. Without a single trace of unnecessary fanfare, he thrust forward with precise, ruthless speed. Squelched the cold blade pierced through Damrata's chest without any hindrance. Before Damrata could feel a shred of pain or panic, pitch-black lightning was injected into his body along the blade. The ferocious black lightning exploded frantically inside him, tearing in all directions as the domineering destructive power completely disintegrated his physical body from within. A series of explosions suddenly rang out, and a blinding tide of black lightning erupted violently. Under the absolute crushing power, Damrata did not even have time to scream before his entire body was blown to pieces from the inside out. His flesh and blood exploded in all directions, leaving not a single intact piece of his body behind as he was completely annihilated. With this, both of the great powerhouses who had come to Grubel's aid, Kondo and Damrata, were dead. High in the sky, Rudra, who had witnessed the entire process, had his surrounding atmosphere turned completely gloomy to the extreme. His eyes locked onto Rimuru, with near-distorted, extreme hatred and deep-seated killing intent surging in his gaze. Anger, unwillingness, the agonizing pain of losing his strongest subordinates, the humiliation of repeated defeats, and the hatred of his beloved dying with her corpse desecrated. All kinds of negative emotions were thoroughly interwoven. The power of faith from the Empire, which originally could not be gathered at all, suddenly underwent an abnormal change at this moment. It was no longer positive faith like loyalty, reverence, and admiration. Instead, all the fear, resentment, anger, and hatred in the hearts of all the Empire's citizens converged toward Rudra. The negative thoughts of 800 million citizens continuously rose, converged, and solidified, turning into a pitch-black, thick, violent, and crazed new torrent that wrapped around Rudra. The scattered power was reborn and revived once more in the name of hatred. The blackish-purple aura around Rudra surged frantically. He raised his head, feeling this continuous, new power filling his body. His long-suppressed voice, trembling with madness, suddenly echoed through heaven and earth. We have heard it. We have felt it. Rimuru feigned a look of confusion, and asked softly in a flat tone. What did you hear? And what did you feel? The madness and hatred accumulated in his chest completely broke through their shackles. Rudra suddenly raised his head, his eyes blood-red, and roared at Rimuru at the top of his lungs. We said. We hear the hatred of the Empire's citizens for you. Are you deaf? Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.